Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. I am joined here by Christopher Tomaszewski. Did I pronounce that right?
It's Tomaszewski.
It's Tom. Dang it! I was
It is
practicing.
Tom.
I was practicing beforehand too. I'm like, I'm going to impress him
Well,
by getting his
so
name
I
right.
I pronounce it Tom. Although I think the proper Polish pronunciation actually is Tom,
Hmm.
Tomaszewski. But I usually end up having to work so hard to get people to understand that the SZ is pronounced like an SH and the W is pronounced like a V,
Mhm.
that I don't. It's kind of overkill to try to harangue them about the pronunciation of the long O as well. So I've kind of just settled into Tomaszewski, but I think that if I'm speaking the proper Polish, it's Tomaszewski. Yeah.
Yeah, and here I was feeling all proud of myself and mighty. I'm like, I'm gonna get his name right. Anyway, thanks for being here. It's cool to have you. You are a philosopher, and we grew up. By the way, for just to get the intro, we're going to talk about God. We're going to talk about the existence of the soul. This is going to be a cool conversation, but just some preliminaries here. I think we grew up in somewhat of the same neck of the woods. We're both Philly boys, if I understand
That's
correctly,
right.
right?
Yeah, no, I grew up in the western part of South Philly, about as far west in South Philly as you can go without being in West Philly,
Mm-hmm.
very close to the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. Um, yeah, and I enjoyed growing up, I think, in Philly for the most part. And I feel, well, yeah, I grew up in a very working class neighborhood that I think has served me well in academia, because academia is mostly populated with people who have grown up in middle class or even upper middle class families and neighborhoods.
Right.
So it has kept me more grounded than I think lots of philosophers are.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I'm from the kind of upper Darby, Delco area, if anybody's familiar with that. Interesting area. Same thing, working class. Everybody lives. It's like those famous, just like strips of row homes, right? Everybody's house looks pretty much the
Oh,
same.
do you know Little Flower Nursing Home?
I I'm sure I've probably been by it, but it doesn't ring
Right.
any immediate
So
bells.
I was a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia for 2 years out of high school, and one of those years, uh, well, as part of the ordinary seminary formation at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary, the seminary for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia,
Yeah.
they sent us out on Thursdays to what were called apostolate days,
Hmm.
where you got pastoral experience, and I was assigned for 1 year to the Little Flower Nursing Home in Upper Darby. So yeah, I spent some time in Upper Darby.
So you're familiar. Yeah. Interesting place. Love going back there. Haven't been in a while. But I'm in the Midwest now. And anyway, certainly enough about me. Let's focus on a little bit more of your history, if you don't mind, Chris.
Sure.
So what do you do now? And well, I already mentioned you're a philosopher, but how did that come about? What got you into philosophy and all the research interests that you're currently working on?
Okay, so yeah, that's connected with what I just mentioned a moment ago, namely my time in seminary. When I was growing up, throughout grade school and most of high school, I really had my heart set on being a mathematician. I was a big math nerd. That was my academic passion. And my academic passions were pretty much my passion simpliciter as a child. Um, but then so right now this is interwoven with, I guess, my history as a Catholic, which was not so great, I guess, throughout my childhood. I did not have a really good grasp of who Jesus was, to put it in a very blunt and short way. Even though I attended I was raised in a Catholic family. I attended Catholic schools. But I didn't understand the importance of Catholic spirituality, of the sacraments, and I was just kind of apathetic and clueless about the Catholic faith in general.
Yeah, which is just pretty common these days. People being
Right.
just a product of poor catechesis, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, the situation in Philadelphia, as I'm sure you're aware, maybe not so much in the Upper Darby area, but certainly in the city of Philadelphia proper. A lot of people go to Catholic school because the alternative is Philadelphia public schools, and if you value your life, you don't go to Philadelphia public schools.
Right.
So going to a Catholic school in Philadelphia is unfortunately often only a reflection of a desire for a certain kind, like a safety, often than more so than a Catholic education on the part of people who send their kids to Catholic schools.
Yeah, who really want a Catholic education,
right?
Not just a different type or place for education.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that was the case with my family necessarily. But the fact that that's the way that it is, I think, influences the way that the faith is taught. And then it's also, I guess, victim to a lot of the general degradation in the quality of Catholic education over the past, 50 years.
Yeah.
Which isn't necessarily the fault of any particular person working there. It's a systemic phenomenon. But at any rate, when I was about 15 years old, I started reading the Summa and the Catholic Encyclopedia on newadvent.com. That was my primary resource site for these kinds of things.
My hobbies were a little different at 15, but I was interested in philosophy as a teenager, but it was different philosophers. But yeah,
so at this point, I'm still not necessarily into philosophy or even have philosophy on my radar as a subject matter that I'm interested in. I'm kind of just like, I'm still very much a math nerd, and I'm also like a huge computer nerd, and so I'm fascinated by all kinds of stuff I find online. And this kind of interest in the Summa and in the Catholic faith really just begins in that way, because I find in the Summa and in the Catholic Encyclopedia presentation of the Catholic faith that I guess the nascent philosopher and mathematician could relate to, something that was built on arguments and rigorous definitions, and instead of whatever were contained in the religion workbooks.
Essentially coloring books, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't even remember what it was, but I do remember very clearly that this had an impression on me that the stuff that the stuff in school was not.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the beginning of an intellectual, I guess, conversion for me to the Catholic faith, and not just to the Catholic faith, but to a very traditionalist interpretation of the Catholic faith. Because one of the things that I never realized as I was absorbing Catholicism through these sources is, and at least with respect to the Catholic Encyclopedia, is that it was written in 1917. I had no idea that was the case. I thought that this was a contemporary resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so funny. Mm-hmm.
And this actually even, this spelled itself out in a way that I'll mention in just a moment. So this intellectual conversion starts happening around the same time. My grandmother has a really serious health scare, which gets my grandfather going back to Mass. And for reasons that I really couldn't describe other than just, the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, I decided to go with them. And I think that's the earliest recollection I have of actually making a decision to go to Mass voluntarily, because I want to.
Right. Yeah.
That leads to, you know, even greater interest in the faith and in the sacraments. Eventually start going back to confession, practicing the faith seriously, and starting to think about the possibility of a vocation to the priesthood, and get in touch with the vocations director at St. Charles. Interestingly, connected with the earlier point I made about the Catholic Encyclopedia and my ignorance of its age, I had mentioned, in connection with things I've read in the Summa, you know, this is an indication of how clueless I was at the time. I actually asked the vocations director for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia whether illegitimacy of birth was still an impediment to ordination. Because I thought that this was like a real issue that still, you know, affected who they would or would not accept as a seminarian. So yeah, I'm like, you know, just forming myself in Catholic doctrine and almost in a bubble.
Yeah, and kind of just on your own too, which is
right.
super fascinating.
Yeah, so very, very much on my own, very much in a bubble. By the time I finally do, I guess, get to about the senior year of high school, I'm more in touch with like my theology teacher in high school, who's a priest and campus minister. So I start to get a little bit more grounding in what the Catholic Church is actually like
in the contemporary scene.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I end up graduating from high school and spending 2 years in seminary, which, as I'm sure you and your listeners know, if you're coming straight out of high school into seminary, Catholic seminary, you have to study philosophy. You have to do a bachelor's degree in philosophy for the first 4 years of your formation. So I was compelled to study philosophy. And I enjoyed, you know, studying philosophy. I end up leaving seminary after 2 years and transferring to Villanova University right down the street.
I used to spend a lot of time at Nova. I've got two pretty good friends that teach there right now.
Oh, cool. And then, you know, at the time I transferred, I was, you know, very much thinking, okay, yep, going to go back to, you know, studying math. That's my thing. And I did that. But I figured at that time I also had enough credits and interest in philosophy to make it worth my while to, you know, do a bachelor's degree in philosophy as well, finish that up. And by the time I was finishing up at Villanova, I came to the realization that, you know, that I was probably better at philosophy than I was at math, and that I was probably also more interested in philosophy than I was in math, because what I really liked about math was, you know, solving puzzles. And math puzzles are great, but it's nice to be able to solve puzzles that addresses a broader set of questions than just the mathematical questions.
Right.
Questions about, you know, whether there's a God and whether we can prove it, whether there's a soul and whether we can prove it, what happens to us after death, et cetera, et cetera.
So let me ask you this real quick, because, you know, we kind of have a similar background. My undergrad wasn't math per se, but it was economics and finance. So I did a lot of math, and then philosophy was master's. And I've always seen a great compatibility and harmony between the two and value in studying both. How do you feel your training and study of mathematics has benefited you as a philosopher, and maybe also vice versa?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know whether I would say that this is a way in which my study of math has benefited me as a philosopher, as much as I think it's something more like the following. The kind of gifts that God has given me and dispositions that God has given me that set me up to like and be good at math in the first place have also made me good at philosophy for the following reason, namely that, as I said before, philosophy, at least the kind of philosophy I do, is mostly about arguments and and particularly about arguments that are often technical, where you have to pay close attention to the definitions and so forth. And that shares a lot in common with mathematical proofs, right? So if you're going to prove in math, for example, that there are infinitely many primes, you really better know exactly what we mean by prime. You better really know exactly what we mean by infinite, and you better have a step-by-step proof where each step follows from the preceding ones, and the final step is one that says that there are infinitely many primes. And a lot of the philosophy that I'm most interested in and do, namely contemporary analytic philosophy and scholastic philosophy, operates in much of the same kind of way. It's not quite as technical as math tends to end up being, but it's something where you have to pay very close attention to the definitions, and where you have to pay very close attention to each step of the argument, and where the success or failure of an argument can entirely hinge on the very slightest, most subtle differences in a definition or in a premise, and so forth.
Yeah,
so
which we'll probably get a taste of once we start talking about divine simplicity as we move on.
Right. So attention to detail, I think, is like to put it briefly, like a willingness to attend carefully to the details. And I get part of it connected with that is like a willingness and ability, because you need both. You definitely need both to reason dispassionately, which is in awfully short supply.
I'm into that, brother.
Today, there's, obviously you kind of see this with our current political situation, just rampant. I hope that it's inability, because I wouldn't want to chalk it up to unwillingness. But I think it is unwillingness sometimes to think through an issue without respect to emotions at all. Of course, that's not to say emotions don't have their place. Emotions do have their place, but their place is not in helping us figure out what's true. Their place is in helping us to act once we've already figured out what's true.
Yeah, and give a good example of this to take it. We can go back into the political paradigm if we want, but I think a keen example of this would be the problem of evil, right? Where sometimes I'll be talking to people about the problem of evil, and I think, hey, I think we can solve it this way. I think we can show that it's actually not an issue for an all good God, and they'll often be unsatisfied with it on an emotional level, right? But that's what you're talking about, right? Is like, no, the point of reason in philosophy is like, okay, sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's abstract, but it gives us the framework and the perspective that we need to do to carry on in spite of emotions. I think that's just the first example that pops into my head. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think of the debates about abortion, where you present a straightforward argument to people that the human fetus is a person, and you are treated to you are unfortunately often treated to invocations of pity or the like for poor unwed pregnant mothers. Not that you shouldn't have pity for them. You certainly should, but it should have nothing to do with how you reason about whether the human person, whether a human fetus is a person, or the morality of homosexual acts. For example, people consist. I rarely, it tends to be the norm rather than the exception that people reason about that issue emotively, rather than trying to reason it through.
Yeah, and some of these issues are so charged that I've certainly found, especially online, when you're face to face with somebody, it's often different, but online, it's near impossible to have any kind of discussion on them.
So the way that math helps, the way that math helps with that is unlike political or moral philosophy, it's really hard to have emotions about math. So
right, when you're just manipulating symbols, it's a little easier, right?
that's right. So if you're dealing with a subject matter like math where the conclusions don't carry any emotional weight, it's a little bit easier to get into that feeling or ethos of reasoning dispassionately.
Mm-hmm.
And then hopefully you can carry that over into your thought about political and moral issues.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really good connection. I appreciate you taking the time on that, Chris.
Sure.
So, okay. So carry us forward then. So you got your kind of, I guess, a dual degree from Nova, right?
That's right.
Math and philosophy. And then, okay, what are your steps after that? Because you're currently a Baylor, right?
That's right.
Okay.
So I had a couple steps after that. I won't bore your listeners with all of that. Just to say that, so I end up first thinking that, I want to do philosophy, but I want to do a very mathematical kind of philosophy. I want to kind of do philosophy of math / logic. Logic being a unique subject matter that's at the intersection of philosophy and math. And for reasons connected to that, I end up being in the PhD program at the University of Connecticut starting in 2012. But while I'm there, I end up reading, a lot of Ed Feser and David Oderberg, other neo-scholastic philosophers, Eleanor Stump, who convinced me, because see, this is something I hadn't been convinced of at that time. Part of the reason I end up being interested in like philosophy, math, and logic is I figure, well, that's kind of what's respectable. That's what the philosophical profession and community will take seriously. Even though, at that point, I basically am convinced that a broadly scholastic worldview is correct, but I don't want to get in. I wasn't thinking that, I could make a life as a philosopher doing that kind of philosophy.
Sure.
So I end up doing philosophy, being interested in philosophy, math, logic, and I go to the University of Connecticut, which is a good place for that. But while I'm there, I get more into neo-scholastic philosophy and the authors that I mentioned before, and I become convinced, kind of through their example, that, oh, wait, no, there actually is a way to make a respectable career as a philosopher doing this kind of philosophy. And so I end up trying to propose a dissertation there on, Thomas Aquinas on truth, the nature of truth, actually. Which they didn't really very much like because nobody there does Thomas Aquinas,
Sure. Yeah.
They have
Who's
no
this
idea.
guy? Yeah.
They have no idea what I'm talking about, and so on. So I end up graduating from the University of Connecticut with just a master's degree, and then I applied out to a number of programs again to do a PhD that to programs that would be more receptive to my new interests, my new philosophical interests. And I ended up at Baylor, and I've been really happy to be here. So I'm now working with Alex Pruss, not on Thomas Aquinas on truth, but rather Thomas Aquinas on the interim state, which we'll be talking about today.
And Pruss he's a pretty smart guy, I think most people would admit.
He is a very smart guy, and what's great about him as a fit for me, as a dissertation advisor for me, is that he, like me, is both a math and a philosophy guy.
He's got 2 PhDs, correct? One in math,
right.
and one in philosophy, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He has a PhD in math from, I think it's the University of British Columbia, and then a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So interestingly, I'm sure he wouldn't mind my saying this. He had intended his PhD in philosophy to merely be a stepping stone to his PhD in theology that he was eventually going to get, but then realized that the kind of theology that he wanted to do only really required a PhD in philosophy.
How about that? So that's cool. That's cool to have him as your director. Okay, so
Yeah,
now we're And all of this is kind of getting us to two of the subjects that we're going to talk about, which are the existence of God and the existence of the soul, and your sort of special research interests and work on both of these topics. And yeah, I always think of Descartes because it seems like it's been a while since I've read the Meditations, but Descartes always took a special interest in these two topics, right? Because he's like, a lot hinges on God and the soul, like a lot. So like, there's two things that are really worth thinking about. You can't really go wrong with these two topics. So it just so happens that your primary research is on the soul, correct? But then you've just kind of had secondary interests on divine simplicity and give us kind of the relevant background there, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So the subject matter of my dissertation is human anthropology from a Thomistic standpoint, and in particular, the survival of two questions about what happens after we die. One, does our soul survive? And two, do we survive? So my dissertation tries to...
Which immediately people are going to be like, wait, what are you talking about, right? Like, how could our soul survive but not we survive? We'll get into that, but I just wanted to mark that distinction.
Right, yeah, sure. So my dissertation just tries to answer those two questions. And of course, the first question of whether, we have a soul and whether it survives our death is a very old one in philosophy. So I try to come at that using some new arguments, which are very Thomistic friendly, but not exactly the arguments you find in Aquinas or even in Aristotle or Plato.
Cool. So all right. So I want to cover both of these topics, and we're going to talk about divine simplicity specifically, and we'll try to make as few assumptions as possible. There's going to be people listening who this might be the first serious philosophical conversation they've heard. So we'll do our best to get people up to speed as we move along, but we probably will get into the deep end of the pool here pretty quickly, I imagine. I'm going to leave it up to you as my guest. Where do you want to start, Chris? You want to start with God or the soul?
Let's do the soul first.
Okay.
And then we can do divine simplicity. Yeah.
All right, cool. So, all right, here's what I want to ask you then, because I mean, this is just a question I'm sure a lot of people will have. Like, one, how do we know we even have a soul? What do we mean by soul? So what arguments do you have, Chris? Could be one argument, could be a series, whatever you want to do to get us to start thinking about the soul. And I guess there's kind of two things that we got to think about. One is not just do we have a soul, but like, what is it? Is there an immaterial aspect to the soul?
Right.
And I know there's debate specifically with Aristotle, where it seems like Aristotle affirmed that the soul was immaterial, but there's debate of whether he argued whether it was immortal or not. And that's kind of the second part, right? Is like, okay, even if the soul has some immaterial aspect about it that's not reducible to physics or chemistry or something like that, do we have reason to think that persists after death? So I'm going to kick it entirely to you now. How do you set this up? And then let's do what we'd love to do, which is get into arguments.
Great. Yeah. So I put down three arguments, I think, here that are fairly easy to introduce and that I think your listeners will enjoy. So yeah, let's just address the existence question first. The way, if you're Descartes or other, contemporary analytic philosophers, often you'll try to jump right into this existence question with respect to the human soul in particular. And I think actually that's somewhat of a mistake, right? And one reason that's a mistake is because before we can get into whether there's a human soul, we have to figure out, well, what do we even mean by soul in general? Are humans the only things that have souls? Is soul a specific kind of a more broad category that we might be able to identify even in non-living things? And as those questions all suggest, I think there's a certain way I have of thinking about this, a way that Aquinas had of thinking about this, and a way that Aristotle had a way of thinking about this, where the question of whether there's a human soul and of whether it survives our death is actually part of a broader metaphysical worldview, right. where the soul is a specific kind of thing, a form that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, that everything is going to end up having. And so, in one way, if we're just talking about the existence of the human soul, I think some of the best arguments for our having a soul in the relevant sense are arguments that actually tend to show that everything, living or non-living, for that matter, has an immaterial aspect to it, if you will. Something which accounts for its ability to persist over change, something that accounts for its ability to gain and lose material parts, and so forth, without becoming something entirely different.
Right. So there's this idea of a sort of nature or essence or organizing principle that accounts for, the sort of endurance of the thing's identity despite the changing of its parts. Right. So.
Right. So and then to move the I think this is really part of the genius of the Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics is once we have that in place, then we can just say, well, whatever that thing is, in the case of human beings, that's what we call the human soul, right? And that has the benefit, I think, of demystifying to some extent what we mean by soul and demystifying the existence of a human soul. Because if you kind of just jump into a discussion of the soul without this background picture of the world, it looks to, I guess, atheists and other skeptics about materialist skeptics about the soul in general, as if you're really just trying to hold on to some kind of piece of religion or something like that. Instead of it being just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, which constitutes your overall metaphysical worldview.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just real quick, we're trying to show that there's a greater metaphysical project that really needs to be undertaken, and one that will include not just material causes, but famously formal causes as well.
That's right.
And once we understand this, it will carry over into the notion of the soul, right?
Right. So the first argument that you might have for the existence of the human soul is, and this is an argument I run through with my own undergrads, is what you might call an argument from change, right? So let's keep it. I'll talk now about human beings and about the kind of formal principle that accounts for their persistence through changes right now. But bear in mind, in light of what I just said, that this is going to be part and parcel of a view about how anything is able to survive change.
Right.
So, you think about yourself when you were a tiny baby. You were, I guess I was about 22 inches long when I was born, and I'm a lot longer than that now, and I'll probably get a little shorter once I'm 80, if I hopefully live to be 80, and I'll get wrinkles when I'm 80. And my hair has probably changed color slightly since I was a small child. Lots of differences between me 30 years ago when I was an infant and me now, and there will be even more differences between me now and how I will hopefully be 50 years from now if I'm still alive.
Right.
And now the question is, how can that baby from 30 years ago be me if it's so different from me, right? It seems like it has so many different properties from me. And in fact, of course, we can't do this because the difference is in time, but if the difference were in space, right, and infant me was sitting next to me here on my couch instead of existing 30 years ago, and you looked at both of us and you would say, clearly, those are not the same thing. That one is much smaller than the other one. He can't even talk. He can't eat solid food. He has no hair, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So there's this, principle that often gets called Leibniz's law, because Leibniz is the first one to articulate it in explicitly this form, although of course he's not the first one to have the idea, that if two things are identical, they have to have all the same properties, right? If X is the same thing as Y, then X and Y better turn out to have all the same properties. And contrapositively, right, going in the other direction, we can say that if two things don't have all the same properties, then clearly they can't be the same thing. So we have this question about how is it that that baby is me, and that old man 50 years from now is me, despite the fact that the baby me and the old man me are so different from me, right, and so different from each other.
Right. And you do have philosophers which will say they're not the same, that there are no enduring selves, right? And it's not just external properties, but internal. It's like, hey, the collection of your cellular constituents have all turned over, right? It's different on multiple levels of analysis. So philosophers just kind of, famously in a sort of reductionistic, virtually nihilistic sense, right, will just say, no, there is no enduring self. The you then is not the same you now. And in fact, the you 5 minutes ago isn't even the same you now.
Sure.
Right?
That's right. So yeah, and and it's not just like contemporary nihilists or materialists who had this kind of issue. Even right, going back to before Aristotle, you have Parmenides and Heraclitus, who are really worried about change in one way or the other, and end up taking polar opposite views about what we should say in light of the reality of change. Parmenides saying that all the change in question is illusory, and Heraclitus taking the opposite view that there's nothing but change, right? You can never step into the same river twice. Everything is transitory and momentary. Nothing lasts except for change.
That's it. And it's, if we could just immediately recognize that there's obviously something that just smells very fishy about this. Like it rebels against our intuitions, because we certainly feel like that was us previously, right? And not only that, but there seems like there'd be bizarre ethical consequences like this too. Like if somebody abused me in the past, they didn't really abuse me, right? So like how could I hold them accountable? They abused something in the past, but it wasn't me, right?
Or how could you be held accountable for anything you had done in the past?
Right. Yeah.
So actually, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, well, it feels like me. It feels like I was the same thing as, at least as far back as I can remember. And so this leads, philosophers like Locke to start saying things like, well, that's what it is for you to be the same thing as you were 5 years ago, say, is for you to just have the memory of being that thing from 5 years ago. And he sets up what is now called the psychological account of personal identity in philosophy, where being the same person over time is just a matter of being psychologically continuous with your past or future self. But of course that, suggests that people who suffer total amnesia are different persons than they were before they suffered that amnesia, which doesn't seem right. So we'd like to have basically a metaphysical worldview, right, on which we can account for the ability of things to change what they're like without changing what they are.
Good distinction.
Okay. So that's what Aristotle, comes along in the wake of Parmenides and Heraclitus and offers us. He says, look, we got to make a distinction here, right? And the distinction we're going to make is between what we're going to call form on one hand and matter on the other. And when things change, say like when the baby me from 30 years ago becomes the adult me of today, there is something that's the same there, and there's something that's different, right? And that seems to capture our intuitions well, right? There's clearly there's something different, but at the same time, the core, if you will, is supposed to be the same. right? It's still me, but it's different features or properties. Different things are true of me. What Aristotle says, right, is, well, it's the, this is going to get a little bit nuanced in a moment. What stays the same is matter, and what changes is form, right? But of course, then he wants to say there's two different kinds of changes we want to talk about when we're talking about change. Accidental changes that we're probably more familiar with, and what he's going to call substantial changes. So accidental changes are where you have the same thing with different kinds of properties. So me from 30 years ago to me today is an accidental change because it's the same substance, it's the same thing, but with different accidents, different properties.
Yeah. Now, I think it's probably worth clarifying, because philosophers, depending on what tradition there are, will use even the term property differently.
Sure.
And this is something that Thomists often take issue with. It's like, well, no, we got to make distinctions among, what is, real properties versus contingent accidents and things like that. So introduce any of those as you think they're relevant to this conversation, but otherwise I don't want to get bogged down in too many technical.
Yeah, it's just, especially when we talk about divine simplicity later, this will come up. But it's worth noting that contemporary analytic philosophers will often use the word property in a very expansive way to talk about basically anything that can be predicated of a thing, anything you can say about something that is not just stating that it's identical to itself. So, if I say that something is red, that's a property. But a lot of philosophers will also countenance saying that something exists alone. Let's put it that way. That something exists alone is a property. Where I think Aristotle is not going to want to countenance that as an accident, because when I say that something exists alone, I'm not really saying something about that thing. I'm saying something about other things, namely that they don't exist.
Right.
So contemporary philosophers tend to flatten out important distinctions that Aristotle wants to preserve when it comes to talking about accidents, and in particular the distinction between real accidents that pick out features that are really to be found in the thing in question, and, for example, logical accidents, if you will, that pick out things that can truly be predicated of the thing, but not on account of things really present in that thing. So that's not going to make too much of a difference here. We might end up talking more about that distinction when we come.
Yeah, that will come back in later.
Yeah.
And just for our sake, maybe a relevant example for the human person would be, it's proper of us to have the ability to laugh, because that sort of flows from our nature, our essence as a rational animal.
Right.
But compare that with something like the color of our skin, which we would say is a contingent accident, right? Like me having white skin versus if I had black skin wouldn't affect what I essentially am. And that's actually one of the metaphysical basis of why racism is wrong, right? You're discriminating on somebody based on a contingent accident, and you're failing. It's literally a fallacy of accident, right? Where you're failing to distinguish the core essence of something and see, no, it's got value in virtue of what it is, not some contingent accident. Separate conversation, but I think it's an interesting tie into a contemporary issue, right?
Right. So so I do want to just let's get back on track with what the argument here is supposed to be. So we have a distinction between form and matter that Aristotle's introduced, where he wants to say that matter is the substrate, if you will, right? That stays the same across changes, and form is what's different. And he wants to distinguish between substantial forms on the one hand and accidental forms on the other. And accidental forms are what change in accidental changes, and substantial forms are what change in substantial changes. And the difference between accidental and substantial changes are just that in accidental changes, the thing remains, but its properties or accidents are changed. Cases of, like I said, of infant me becoming man me, adult me, is an accidental change. It's a whole slew of accidental changes. But if I burn a tree down, for instance, and the whole tree is turned to ash, clearly we don't want to say that the tree has remained, but has just taken on ashy properties, right, or ashy accidents. Clearly, that's a case where the thing itself has been destroyed. And because the thing itself has been destroyed, we have what Aristotle would have termed a substantial change and not merely an accidental change.
Right.
So once we have that all in place, we can now account for, right, all the kinds of changes we want to account for. And in particular, we can account for changes over time in human beings in terms of accidental changes where the accidental forms, the form that gives me hair, for instance, as opposed to having no hair, I can acquire that form, while the matter, which in this case is the substance, the me, stays the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so this allows us to say, okay, well, what is it that stays the same over time? Substance.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it that changes over time? Accidents.
Mm-hmm.
But note that what we've also introduced, right, in giving this explanation is substantial changes and substantial forms. And one other thing that Aristotle's going to want to say about substantial form is that substantial form is what accounts for the substance staying the same over time, right? So when I get older, if you ask the question, well, how is my getting older different than burning the tree down? Well, the difference is that my substantial form stays the same, whereas the tree's substantial form does not. The tree's substantial form is destroyed and replaced by the substantial form of ash, or whatever organic molecules constitute ash. Right. So in order to preserve this idea of substance and preserve the idea that substance can persist while the accidents change, we have to talk about substantial forms, things that allow substances to persist while the properties change. And that substantial form in the case of human beings is just what we call the soul. Now, there's lots more that we can say about the soul, especially in the case of human beings. It does a lot more than just account for our identity over time. It's the seat of the intellect and the will and the soul and our capacity to respond spiritually to God and to grace. It does a whole host of things that's too long for me to run down now. But the point here is just that most fundamentally, when I say most fundamentally, that's not, you shouldn't confuse that with most importantly. Mm-hmm. But most fundamentally, what it does in our metaphysics is account for the fact that I'm the same person that I was 30 years ago, and I'm the same person that I hopefully will still be 50 years from now. So that's a sketch of what I would call the argument from change. You have to be able to account for the persistence of things during change. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the best account for being able to do that involves stipulating the existence of substantial forms that give substances their identity over time. Right. Now, one thing to note, of course, about substantial forms is that they themselves cannot be a material thing, because if they were, they'd be subject to change in much the same way as any other material thing. And then we have to inquire into how they themselves could persist through those changes, and we'd find ourselves in the same kind of philosophical predicament.
Right. Yeah. So that was one of the points I was going to pick out. So thanks for teasing that out for us already. And I think it's maybe worth noting that if you kind of deny this and you go back to the previous position that we're not the same person, it seems like we would very quickly lose reason as well, because we wouldn't even be able to stay the same long enough to move from premise to premise. right?
Right. Yeah. So denying this, denying the reality of personal identity over time would be radical in the extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And in fact is
and unsustainable, right? Mm-hmm.
unsustainable because it's ultimately performatively self-refuting, right? So like if you were to try to give me an argument for the conclusion that I don't persist over time, then you would have to, it wouldn't be you giving me that whole argument, right? You would give me one premise, and then your future successor would give me the next, and his future successor would give me the next, and so on. There would be a team of yous that would be giving me the argument, or rather, a team of yous giving the team of me's the argument, so to speak. So there wouldn't be a single subject to make or to be convinced by arguments.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's funny you brought up Leibniz's law. That immediately just kind of brought me back to some of the arguments contemporary philosophers like Plantinga will sometimes give for the soul, where they'll say, okay, if we go by Leibniz's law, then anything we conceive of X, we'll have to conceive of Y. But I can conceive of myself in the body of an antelope, for example, or I can conceive of myself as a disembodied soul, but I can't, for obvious reasons, conceive of my body as a disembodied soul. So there seems to be something distinct here between body and soul. So right. I don't know if you like that argument, if you reject that argument, if that plays into it all, but it's just kind of an interesting contrast of how you set up what I think is the better way to do it. I think we do got to get some metaphysical clarity first versus people who kind of just hop right into, let's see if the body is the soul or the brain is the soul or something like that, right?
Right. So yeah, I guess the important thing to note is everything I just said is, as far as it goes, at least, not unique to human beings, right? Other living things and even inanimate things like water and rocks are subject to these same kind of worries. They change over time, but we want to say they're the same somehow. So we better have an account for being able, a metaphysical account of how we're able to truly say those things. And Aristotle's hylomorphism gives us the best account of how we're able to say those things in a way that's consistent with common sense, although it develops common sense.
And because maybe a potential objection somebody will have at this point is like, okay, that sounds nice, but that also sounds like it's like some really weird, outdated science. And I just happen to have in my hand a new article by Robert Koons, who makes the argument that hylomorphism actually gives us the best account of science, and even his arguments for ontological escalation. I haven't finished it yet, so I don't want to remark too specifically on it about halfway through. But what would you say to that generally of people who try to maybe dismiss everything you've argued as some type of outdated science? And we've grown clearly, Chris, we've grown beyond this. Come now and catch up with the ages, right?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, well, before I get into that, I will just second your recommendation to your listeners of all of Rob Koons' work, which is fantastic. Some of it might, such as the paper that you mentioned, might be a little too deep for philosophical beginners, but he does have great material once you're ready and able to read it. As for, so the science objection requires us to make another careful distinction between metaphysics and a certain kind of metaphysics that we might call philosophy of nature. Contemporary analytic philosophers don't really talk about it that way. They just put it all under the heading of metaphysics. Mm-hmm. But the scholastics talked about a philosophy of nature that is distinct from, and in fact, theoretically prerequisite to natural science as we understand it today. So nothing I just said is dependent on any kind of scientific theory, whether ancient or contemporary, and nothing that I said is an article of science per se. In fact, it is everything that I just said about change and Aristotle's hylomorphism is in fact something which, once properly understood, is in fact prerequisite theoretically to doing natural science. You actually better end up believing in hylomorphism if you want to do any science at all, regardless of what those natural sciences end up showing. And the reason for that is unless you can account for change, you can't account, for example, for experimentation. And if you can't account for experimentation, because experimentation involves change. Right. And when scientists are doing experiments, they're making assumptions about what is persisting across certain kinds of changes and what's not, based on their experiments, right? No purely scientific experiment, for example, can prove or disprove that I'm the same thing that existed as an infant 30 years ago. You can make certain kinds of empirical observations. You can say, well, across space-time, there was what appeared to be a single thing that changed its properties over time, but the empirical data leaves underdetermined whether there was a substantial or merely accidental change there. And to answer that question, we got to do, some genuine metaphysics that's going to be, like I said, more fundamental than and theoretically prerequisite to natural science as we understand it. So to take a perhaps clearer example, burning the tree down, and it becomes ash. Well, what really happened? Did I just change the tree into an ashy tree, or did I destroy the tree and replace it with ash? And there's nothing about what you see. You can put a whole team of scientists on the ground as I burn the tree down and let them do all the scientific experiments they want. And they'll get lots of data about how hot the fire was and how long it burned and what the chemical composition of the tree was before and after burning and so on. But none of that will tell you whether the ashes that remain is a very weird tree or an entirely different kind of thing. Right. And that's the realm where we're working, right? In order to answer that kind of question, you have to know something about what trees are. And you have to know something about what trees are, a particular kind of thing about what trees are, namely their essences, that natural science, for all its benefits, is not going to be able to tell you, because it's just not something that can be settled by experimentation. Right. And I should note, having said all that, natural science is fantastic. I love iPhones as much as the next guy, and the scientific method, as developed in early modernity by Catholic scientists, has been an enormous force for good. But unfortunately, it has been such an enormous force for good, and it has been so enormously successful over the past 500 years that it has led many into the error of thinking that it can answer every kind of question. Some people are even so bold as to suggest that moral questions can be answered by natural science. So you have the moral landscape written by Sam Harris, who should know better because he has an undergraduate degree in philosophy.
Yeah, I can forgive. I can occasionally forgive a Richard Dawkins, on the first strike, because it's okay, yeah, you totally ventured out of your lane, you made a fool of yourself.
Right.
But when you keep doing it, despite not just theist philosophers, but atheist philosophers saying this is embarrassingly bad. I don't know how many times you can keep making excuses for somebody. But Harris, who at least has an undergrad in philosophy, what's his excuse, man? This is anyway. I don't want to get too far afield here, but I think that's sufficient, Chris, to show that no, we need metaphysics, a good metaphysics, to properly interpret science. And there's another saying that I generally agree with, that you're never going to pull more metaphysics out of science than you put in, right? So they're different domains.
Right.
metaphysics is first philosophy. There's no competition here in levels of analysis. There may be different levels of analysis, but if we want to do metaphysics, we have to do metaphysics. Science is a different field. So cool. Now going back, you said you had 3 arguments.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So this the second one is what I'll call an argument from vagueness, and it's similar to the argument from change, but it's it doesn't require us to think about time in the way that the argument from change does.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument from vagueness goes roughly like this: were I to lose my right index finger here, I would obviously still continue existing, right? So me minus my index finger is still me. Mm-hmm. But me minus my index finger exists right now, right? If you can just ignore my index finger and look at the rest of me, that thing exists right now. But we just agreed that if I had lost my index finger, that thing that remained would be me. So if it exists now, then that thing is me right now. But the whole me is also me. So it looks like there's 2 me's, right? There's the whole me, and then there's me minus my index finger. They both seem to be equally good candidates, in some sense at least, for being me. And then you can run this argument over and over again, right? Me minus my left index finger seems to also be a good candidate for being me, because I could survive losing my left index finger. Mm-hmm. And you can run that argument, you can run that kind of thought experiment over and over again with each part of my body that I could at least theoretically lose while still surviving. So, but then if you think that all those parts of me are me, or all those parts of me are persons, let's put it that way, right? All those parts of me are persons, then it looks like there are millions, billions, maybe even trillions of people sitting where I am right now. Mm-hmm. Because they're all distinct from each other, right? Because they all have at least one part that another doesn't. And yet they're all persons, right? They're all persons because they could be me, right? If I were to just lose the relevant part, they would be me. Therefore they seem like, and they exist now, and I'm a person. So it seems like there's trillions of persons sitting where I am right now. Mm-hmm. That's absurd. So we better have some story to tell about how there aren't trillions of persons sitting where I am right now. So this problem in contemporary philosophy is often categorized as a problem of material constitution. How is it that you get all the parts of something to be just one thing?
Yeah.
You can think about this in terms of other things as well. Clouds are a really good example. What makes it, when we're looking from the ground up into the sky, it might seem easy, at least sometimes, to say, to look at the boundary of a cloud and say, oh, that's just one thing there. But if you've ever been in a plane and actually flown through a cloud, you can see that the boundaries are really fuzzy, mm-hmm. and they're actually just made up of lots and lots of water molecules suspended in the air. So it seems like when you get in the plane and you actually fly through the cloud, that the existence of clouds, or at least the unity of clouds, is a lot more suspect than it was when you were sitting on the ground.
Yep.
If you look at a mountain range, for instance, right, and you see the various peaks, someone could legitimately ask you, right, well, where does the one mountain end and the other mountain begin? And it seems like there's often no good answer to those questions. So these are problems of what gets termed in philosophy, problems of material constitution, or problems of vagueness. How do you get all the parts of a thing to be one, and how do you draw the lines, right, between where one thing ends and the other thing begins?
Right. So another example might be, when does the ferret on Pat Flynn's face finally become a beard? Right.
Sure. Or when do people become bald, right? Clearly, having just one hair on your head is not enough to make you not bald. But clearly, I'm not bald. So exactly how many do you got to have before you're not bald?
Right.
And there's no good answer to those questions. Now, when it comes to boldness and mountain ranges and clouds, it might be fine to just say we don't know, or more to the point, or perhaps even more strongly, not only do we not know, there's no fact of the matter. They're just perhaps because it turns out there's no such thing as clouds, right? So ideas along these lines might lead you to just say, well, I only want to believe in the really determinate, clear-cut kind of things that I can quantify and find the determinate borders of, and so forth. And if I can't do that with clouds, then I don't believe in clouds, right? I'm just gonna say there are no clouds.
Yeah, or maybe they're an aggregate or something like that, right?
Right. So the same way and you'll say it's fine that it's right. You'll say what there are loose aggregates of water molecules suspended high in the air.
Right.
And you'll say, and people will be like, well, we talk about clouds all the time, so doesn't that mean there are clouds? And you'll say something like, well, yeah, we also talk about the sun rising, but we know the sun doesn't actually rise.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, what's happening is the Earth's rotating. So, you want to talk about clouds, that's fine, but just remember that you're really just talking about loose aggregates of water molecules high in the air.
Mm-hmm.
And there really is no such thing as a cloud, a single thing there called a cloud. And as long as you remember that, you can talk about clouds. And philosophers, have generalized this to all kinds of things. Like lots of philosophers don't believe in any kind of artifacts at all. They don't believe in chairs or tables or water glasses,
Mm-hmm.
or houses or cars. There's just things arranged car-wise, things arranged house-wise, things
Right.
arranged table-wise, and so on. Now, of course, the thing is, you definitely don't want to say this about human beings. Although Peter Unger is an example of somebody who used to say this about human beings. He doesn't anymore. He's actually become a substance dualist precisely because of concerns like this. You don't want to say about this about human beings, because although you might get suspicious about whether there are clouds due to the kind of concerns that I just outlined, those kind of concerns are not going to make you doubt whether there's really a you, because the difference between you and clouds is that you have a sense from the inside that
Mm-hmm.
there's a you, right? Whereas you can't really get a sense of whether there are clouds from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
You can only go on your own observations and philosophical reasoning about it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I look to myself, right, I can say, well, of course I exist, and of course that you mentioned Descartes earlier. The cogito is often taken as one of the few successes in outright philosophical demonstration, about which there can be no doubt in philosophy. I think that's wrong, but I
I was going to say there's people who challenge that, right? Yeah.
right, yeah. So no, I think it's wrong, not because the cogito is wrong. I think the cogito is right, but because I think
There is other successful demonstrations. I agree.
other really good successful demonstrations that are, and they're actually much more common than
I think they're better than Descartes.
yeah.
Frankly, yeah.
But the reason I mention it, of course, is right. Descartes bases his demonstration on the kind of performative self-contradiction we would be engaged in if we were to doubt our own existence. And right, I mean, if I can doubt it, then who's doing the doubting?
Mm-hmm.
So there better be. So what this leads to, right, is that there better be some kind of story to tell about how the kind of worries that I was talking about earlier that could lead us to worry about whether there even are clouds or tables or houses doesn't apply, that those worries don't apply to human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you need is some kind of principle of unity that's going to say that's going to enable you to be able to say, look, that thing exists, and here are all its parts, and here's where its boundary is, so to speak, right? At least in principle. I'm not suggesting that belief in the soul is going to enable you to determine where exactly the boundary of you stops and other things begin. You might still have like scientific worries, for example, about whether hair is actually is hair part of me, or is it like a waste product of me that gets produced?
Right, but we can know that there are boundaries, even if we don't know what those boundaries
That's right.
are. Mm-hmm.
So we're searching for a principle of three things: existence, something that's going to guarantee that I exist, something that's going to guarantee unity, because existence and unity are going to go hand in hand. If I'm anything, I'm one thing, and something that's going to make me determinate, right? It's going to be determinate as to what parts are my parts, right? Where do I stop and the couch begins? To be able to answer that, at least make it possible for God to know what the answers to those questions are, even if we can't, because of limitations of science and so forth. And it turns out that the kind of formal causes that we were talking about with earlier in the argument from change is the best candidate for that, precisely because formal causes lack material parts. And you'll note that the way that this whole problem of vagueness got going is because of material parts. We were worried about how all the parts came together to be just one thing, and where one thing's parts end and another thing's parts begin. It's the having of material parts that generates the problem. So if we can, if there would exist a formal cause, a form of a thing that didn't have those material parts, that was at least materially simple, devoid of material parts, then that could serve as a ground for the unity and existence of material things.
Right.
In a way that, in a way where I would still have material parts, but this immaterial thing, this thing that doesn't have any material parts, would be capable of grounding my existence and unity in a way that would render me immune from the kinds of doubts that I illustrated concerning vagueness.
Yeah. So again, kind of returning back to this immaterial organizing principle. I'd say organizing principle. I think that's how Stump typically talks about it. I don't know if you like that or use different terminology or not, but
I like that as far as it goes. Yeah, I like that as far as it goes. Organizing principle, where of course the reason why we want an organizing principle here is because we're worried about where one thing's parts begin. Where one thing's parts end and another thing's parts begin, and we're worried about whether the parts in question compose anything at all, or is it just the parts, or is there a whole over and above the parts? So the existence of a soul that gives unity and existence to material things like ourselves is going to be desirable given this worry. And so the argument basically is something like this: well, if there is no human soul, then there's vagueness, there's real ontological vagueness in human beings. But if there's real ontological vagueness in human beings, then there are no human beings, right? Because there's no way to non-arbitrarily decide which of my parts is me, right? So go back to the beginning where I said, well, what about me minus my index finger? Right. Why isn't that me, and and the me with my index finger is not me? What makes me be the thing that has exactly the parts that I have? Well, right, that's where Aristotle's idea of form informing matter comes in, right? Well, we can say, well, my parts are all the parts informed by my form. they're all the pieces of matter, to speak very roughly, that are united to my form, and the form in turn unites all those material parts and makes them be one single material thing.
Right. And there's a coordination as well, especially at least among living things. There's a coordination, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just reemphasize that, like, right, nothing material is going to be able to serve that function.
Mm-hmm.
But suppose that you said that there was something material that served that kind of function. Well, then I could turn around and subject that to the same kind of worries about vagueness. Like, can we be sure that that thing's parts compose any unity at all? Mm-hmm. And even if they do, where do that thing's parts stop and another thing's parts begin? And we can run the same kind of worries about it. So the only way to get away from those worries is to stipulate the existence of something which is the ground of material things' existence and unity, which is not itself material, but is the ground of our existence and unity as material things. Because of course I want to note, right, I'm not suggesting here that I just am my soul, that I'm an immaterial thing. Mm-hmm. I want to suggest that an immaterial thing is what accounts for me as a material thing, mm-hmm. existing and being a determinant with respect to what parts I have.
Right. And this is a subtle but important distinction, which I'm sure we'll get into. This is fascinating stuff, Chris. I love these arguments. That one from vagueness is, I've heard like kind of general gestures at it before, but this is a very cool presentation. And one thing I wanted to say about that again is, people often prefer a lean ontology, right? Let's not stipulate things any more than we have to. But I think what you're saying is, no, we have to stipulate this, right? If we don't, we're just going to be driven straight to absurdity. So like, yeah, simpler, leaner ontologies is great, but we also need to consider explanatory power and depth as well.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that one way of summing up the takeaway of this argument, right, is that it's really, ends up being impossible to be a materialist, a straightforward materialist, in a way that comports with our common sense intuition about what material things exist, right? So you might have thought that being a materialist only put you at odds with perhaps common sense about what kind of immaterial things exist. But the argument from vagueness helps us to see that the refusal to recognize immaterial things actually puts the materialist at odds about what material things exist on common sense. It ends up being that you got to say. So there actually are there are philosophers, right, who take this view. They're called mereological nihilists. They don't think there are any composite material objects. Trenton Merrickx and Peter Van Inwagen are the most famous examples. And Van
Inwagen's interesting because he is a Christian.
so is Trenton Merrickx. They're both
Christian.
I
didn't know that about Trenton.
Actually, yeah. Okay. They're interestingly both Christians. You run into a lot of Christians in philosophy who are very happy to I guess. Now, of course, it should be noted both Peter and Trenton actually do believe in human beings. For Trenton, for reasons very similar to the ones that I just gave, although he doesn't talk about souls or forms. But he cuts the difference between human beings and other things in a very similar way. But he doesn't believe in, chairs or cars or houses or anything like that.
Right.
And so, the important takeaway here is like you can't even really be a common sense materialist about what material things exist without talking at least about forms.
Yeah. Awesome. Good stuff. Okay. Argument number 3, good sir, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is partly inspired by recent events, and you already mentioned it. This is connected with, I guess, worries about racism. This is kind of like a moral argument for the existence of souls. And of course, but race wouldn't be particularly unique in this respect, right? So I just call this the argument from the equality of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has the intuition that, and it's more popular than ever, I guess, in human history to have the intuition that all human beings are equal. Mm-hmm. And people
equal in moral worth, at least.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I was going to get to that in a moment. Right now, I just want to say that they're equal, right?
Okay.
That's the intuition as it gets expressed. Mm-hmm. In popular culture, and even, you know, from the pulpit of churches, human beings are equal. Now, or you know, you might hear everybody's equal, and so forth. Now, of course, the interesting question about that, and the question I would hope that people would ask themselves more often when they hear other people say that is, well, equal in what respect? In general, actually, I think people would be well served when they hear lots of claims to ask themselves the question, in what respect?
Yeah, you know who's great at that? Not people on Facebook, but children, right? So I have four children. I said five, not to five yet, before. And they're such good natural philosophers and theologians, the types of questions that kids ask. It's just, I think it was Mortimer Adler who said that philosophy is really just returning to all those questions you asked as a kid, you know, after all the adults told you to stop asking annoying questions, and then trying to take them seriously again. I'm like, that sounds about right to me. Yeah.
So, you know, this is an exercise I often run through, for example, with my undergrads on a regular basis. You know, I talk to them about analogy, and not like the Thomistic doctrine of analogy, and nothing as complicated as all that, but just ordinary analogy, you know, like the kinds that you find on the SAT, or that you used to find on the SAT. I guess they got rid of them. Right, just saying that one thing is similar to another in a certain respect, and noting that most comparisons, you know, right, are a kind of analogy that we do. And the reason why I run through this with them is because it's unfortunately endemic to our moral discourse and discourse in general today to balk at comparisons of things, right? So one place that this comes through very virulently, to return to the subject matter, right, is the discussions about homosexuality. So, you know, politicians back before you know, it became completely politically forbidden to say anything negative about homosexuality.
Even sexual ethics in general.
Or sexual ethics in general, right? You had people like, I don't know if Rick Santorum did. I think Rick Santorum is one of the people who ran into trouble for doing this kind of thing, of comparing homosexual acts to bestiality, right? He's and people were outraged that he compared homosexual acts to bestiality, but that nobody ever asked themselves, well, in what respect did he compare them? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, so the exercise I run through with my undergrads is I tell them, like, look, everything that exists is comparable to everything else that exists in some respect,
insofar as it exists, right? I mean, just like try to imagine that things are completely dissimilar. You can't.
Right. Exactly. So, you know, I say to them, like, Satan and I are alike in that we're both persons. Hopefully not in too many other respects, but at least in that respect, Satan and I are alike, right? And I use that example precisely because it's so evocative, right? Nobody would want to be compared to Satan,
right?
But you know, but if they can hopefully see, right, that, like, oh, okay, well, now you know, I can see that, I can see what you're saying, and get past this kind of like brute emotional response to discussion of or to just making comparisons in general. Right. So it all depends on what the respect is. So to return to like the Santorum controversy, right? I mean, it all depends on what the respect is. Like if Santorum was comparing, if Rick Santorum was saying that homosexual acts and bestiality were similar in every respect, then maybe some outrage would be merited. But if he was just saying that they were similar in respect to being immoral, or similar in respect to being contrary to the purpose of the one's procreative faculties, then that's actually, you know, that should not, I mean, that's not the kind of thing that should evoke outrage, but rather should evoke thought and you know, reasoned discussion,
right,
about whether you know, about whether he's right one way or the other.
Yeah, whether there is, whether teleology and ethics applies to sex or wherever, it just, yes, all.
Or even, you know, if he were to say that they're alike in that, you know, one leads to the other. If you accept one, you don't have any principled basis for objecting to
reject the other, right?
And of course, that's the sort of thing, you know, if that's the kind of comparison he's making, well, you might be able to accept that even if you think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with homosexual acts or with bestiality, right? You might be able to just see that, like, the logic naturally leads you to that place,
right? And there's people already on that end of the spectrum who make that argument, right?
Well,
who are for all that stuff. Not to turn the conversation completely around, but it's important to realize that, right?
Not so much with bestiality, but it definitely came to fruition with respect to, say, polyamory. That's becoming increasingly popular.
Yeah.
Anyway, right. So
and pedophilia, it's out there.
Yeah. So very unfortunately. So comparisons, that the respect is very important. And of course, the flip side to that is that when we say things are equal, the respect is very important. And the respect almost never gets specified. There's a lot. So unfortunately, because the respect never gets specified, a lot of what people are expressing when they say that that all human beings are equal is really pure sentiment, because until you express the respect of the equality, you haven't really said anything.
Correct.
You haven't said anything at all. It's not merely that you said something false, or you've said something that is incomplete. I don't think you've said anything at all simply by saying that all human beings are equal until you specify the respect of the equality. Just like you haven't said anything at all just by saying that, like, you know, Satan and I are alike. It's like, well, like how?
Which I think would be people's most immediate response. Like if you were just say to anybody, "Hey, me and Satan, we're alike," I think people would immediately say, "What do you mean? How are you alike?" So it's
right.
amazing how that intuition remains on so many other examples, except for those like very politically charged issues.
Right. Well, and I mean, yeah. So, and I think a lot of that's just people being not well. Emotion just shutting down thinking, right? Just as soon as you hear the comparison, emotion takes over and thinking is out the window. Unfortunately, there may also be an element there of people who know that what they're doing is a logical error and are still doing it for political advantage. I hope that's not the case. Right. But anyway, so right, okay, but we do have this intuition that there's some respect in which human beings are alike, and then we're tasked with the hard question, at least if we're skeptics about the soul, of saying in what respect human beings are equal. And this actually might feed into why the respect doesn't get specified, because I don't think, like, I think it ends up being the case, as I'll try to illustrate in a moment, that you can't specify the respect in which human beings are equal without appealing to something, to the soul in one way or another.
Correct.
Or at least saying something which depends upon or entails the existence of a human soul.
Yeah.
So, you know, of course, you know,
which I will claim right now is going to entail a number of consequences of great political importance that a lot of people just aren't going to want to accept. Right.
Yeah. Right. So, now, okay, so what are some good candidates for the respect in which human beings are equal? Well, you know, it's obviously nothing physical. Human beings differ physically in all numbers of ways, right? We're not equal in height, We're not equal in strength. We're not equal in running ability or jumping ability or any kind of athletic ability whatsoever.
That's right. Muscle fiber distribution, et cetera.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Physical differences between men and women are dramatic. There are, and yet, different physical differences between the races, physical differences between men and women, as I had mentioned. Some people are unfortunately born with physical birth defects that makes them look very different from other people sometimes, and maybe even their bodies don't operate the way that they should.
Mm-hmm.
So it really looks hopeless, or saying that the relevant equality consists in anything physical.
Right.
And then you might say something, well, it's something like, intelligence maybe, but, obviously we're not all equally intelligent. Some people are smarter than others. And it's also, it's also, at least some of that intelligence is heritable, right? The genetics and social science bear out very clearly that intelligence, at least to some degree, is something that's inherited. So you can't just say that, well, we're all born equal, but made different by nurture with respect to intelligence. Some people are just born more intelligent than others, and there's really no way to get around that.
They picked the right parents. Lucky them.
Consistent with the evidence. There's no way to get around that. And then I think people will finally settle on something like, well, we're all morally equal. But of course, when we say that, we don't mean that we're all like equally good people, right? Clearly, some people are more virtuous than other people. And sometimes even that is something you can't fully attribute to nurture. Lots of people are unfortunately born with various dispositions to various kinds of sins. And some people might be more disposed to sin than other people. And I guess I shouldn't use the word sin, because that's importing theological context into it. That I don't want anybody to think that the argument depends on that theological.
Yeah, context. We can say behaviors.
Right. So some people are born, for example, with a disposition to be alcoholics. It's there's some genetic components to that. Right. And some people I don't know, that I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there's a genetic component to kleptomania, for example, right? So people are born with various dispositions to moral disbehavior, and its various kinds. And of course, people are not only born with different inclinations to different kinds of moral disbehavior, but also it seems reasonable to think they're also born with different born with dispositions of different intensities toward those forms of moral misbehavior. And so even there, you can't get away from the nature dimension of it as well. People are not born equally morally good. And then, of course, even if they were, nurture steps in. People learn bad habits, all kinds of things. They make the wrong friends, and so on. And you end up in a world where full of saints and sinners. People who are very well behaved, and other people who are very evil. Hitler and other examples abound. But we want to say, even about like Hitler and Mother Teresa, for example, that there's something equal about them. So it's nothing physical, it's not intelligence, it's not how good they are morally, but there is something equal about them. And it's at this point, I think, that the materialist, at least, is exhausted in terms of possible explanations for what's equal about them. Now, I think it is actually, there is something morally equal about them, but it's not their moral agency. It's not how good their moral agency is that's equal about them. I think what's equal about them is their worth as moral patients, their worth as as people to whom moral things are done or not done, not the respect in which they themselves do good things or don't do good things. Right? There's certain ways it would be wrong to treat even Hitler, in virtue of the thing that's equal about him with Saint Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
Right. But it's nothing. It's nothing physical. It's not intelligence. It's not their moral behavior. It's nothing like that. So what is it? Well, I think most people at this point, if I had pushed them this far, they would say, well, they're both still human beings. They're still both persons. But even there, you have to say, okay, well, right, but like, even if they're both still human beings, and even if they're still both persons, what is it that makes them both be human beings? Or what is it that makes them both be persons? And more particularly, what is it that makes them both be human beings who have the same fundamental rights and the same fundamental value on a certain level? And what is it that makes them be persons that have the same fundamental rights or the same fundamental value at a certain level? And it's there that the stipulation of a soul that makes them both be human beings, and makes them both be in the image of God. If we want to take a theological take on it, becomes extremely useful, because then it enables us to specify a respect in which they actually are equal. They both have exactly the same kind of soul, a soul that makes them be human beings, and a soul that is in the image of God, and it makes them to be in the image of God. Right. So that's roughly the argument from equality.
Right. So the idea here is, if you are committed to this idea of equality, which I think is what you're saying, is it seems like I hope most people are, like, I hope everybody is committed to this idea of equality, then you're going to be committed to everything we've essentially been arguing for, that there is an immaterial aspect about us, some formal organizing principle that gives a sort of ontological structure to our being, right? And
right.
Go ahead.
Because if you don't have that, then you really don't have any good objection to the person who says, well, I want to treat people according to like what their race is, or I want to treat some people better because of what race they are, or I want to treat some people better because of what sex they are, or I want to treat some people better because of how intelligent they are.
Yeah, or their level of performance in some respect, right?
That's
Which
right.
is another thing, or how conscious they are, right? So then people can discriminate without if you want to deny this, then we're saying we open up the grounds for discrimination on things like size, level of development, degree of dependency, skin color, intelligence, like all these horrible things, right? All these horrible things. So I guess somebody could like bite the bullet on that, I guess. But what you're trying to do is like raise the moral price tag and say, like, look, man, like, you're going down a path here that opens up a whole bunch of avenues that are pretty grotesque, right?
So I think the way this actually plays out, obviously lots of people, almost nobody actually wants to discriminate on the basis of race or sex or intelligence or things like that. At least not when they're thinking through it carefully and not subject to, biases. But I think a lot of people are very okay, for example, with discriminating based on the morality of the person, for example, with saying, this is, I think, part of how we got very confused about what capital punishment is supposed to be about. We're very fine with, we're okay with treating people differently on the basis of how well they've treated us or how
Right.
well
So,
they've treated third person.
so somebody might actually feel okay about doing certain things to Hitler because he's Hitler that they would never imagine.
That's right.
To somebody else.
Things
Right.
like, this leads to really bad moral confusions because, so, you'll find people who are okay, for example, with torturing Hitler, for example, because they think, well, he has it coming to him. Look at all the things he's done. You don't think he deserves to be tortured? And without realizing that, well, no, I mean, if you want to say that everybody's actually equal in some respect, you have to hold there to be some kind of baseline. Of course, you're going to treat people like Hitler different in some ways, for sure, but you have to hold there to be some kind of baseline level of treatment below which we can't even subject Hitler to
It's
that
always unacceptable. Yeah, because there might be certain punishments that are appropriate or due to people.
Right. So, for example, you might think, based on some kind of like, eye for an eye kind of reasoning, right? Like, well, if someone commits rape, then they should be raped themselves. And that intuition, that somewhat ugly intuition comes out often when you see people talk about, people who have been committed some kind of sexual violation, they go to prison and people hope that they get the same kind of treatment.
Let me just say something about that. It's always struck me as bizarre that for some reason people who normally are totally opposed to rape, which everybody should be, are suddenly okay with people being raped in jail, even if they never committed, rape. Like sometimes it's okay to joke about how funny it is that people are getting raped in prison just because they're in prison. And that's always struck me as quite depraved.
Right. Yeah. But, right. Like if you don't think that there's like a principle of human dignity that entitles us all to a baseline level of moral consideration, then, thinking that, well, if somebody does something bad enough, maybe they have it coming to them. That will be a much more attractive, that'll end up being a much more attractive point of view. And I think you do see people often operating, at least implicitly, from a kind of view like that. What I don't think they realize is that they're actually betraying the intuition that they hold that, everybody's equal in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that equality ultimately entitles everybody to like I said, a baseline level of moral consideration, such that there are some things which can never permissibly be done to any human person.
Right, and that still allows for due punishment, of course. But we're saying there is a baseline.
As I said, there's a multitude of ways we're going to treat Hitler differently than Saint Mother Teresa.
Right.
But there's some ways in which we're not going to treat them differently. There's certain kinds of treatment that we're not going to subject anybody to on the basis of their inherent
behavior,
their inherent moral dignity as human beings, as human persons. And there's no as my line of reasoning up to this point, I hope has shown, there's no physical basis for that ascription of equal human dignity to human beings, because any possible physical basis is one which in fact differs across human beings, and because of that, there had better be something like a human soul.
Right. So just to give a quick summary then of the argument so far, you kind of have two arguments where if we don't postulate the existence of this sort of immaterial aspect, this organizing principle, but we're really talking about the human soul, at least in the case of us, right? We're going to be driven to absurdity. We're just not going to be able to make sense of literally anything, right? So we've got those. But then in addition to that, if we deny this, we're also going to be opening the door to moral consequences that no sane person either should accept or will want to accept.
That's right.
Right. Fair. What do you think? Yeah. How you doing on time, by the way? Because we've been jamming for a while. So
I'm fine. Yeah.
Awesome. Sweet, man. Because I'm loving this. I really appreciate it, Chris.
Great.
What do you think then? Because this is actually good timing, because about 2 weeks ago, I just kind of gave a sketch of different arguments. So this is a nice supplement or complement to that. two things I want to kind of get your thoughts on when it comes to the soul. One would be the sort of arguments from that like James Ross would give, right? They're kind of a little bit more technical. So you already know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah,
Do you incorporate those? Do you think they're good arguments? If so, I'd love
I
to hear.
do. So yeah, when I said earlier that I'm using some Thomistic like arguments, but arguments that Thomas himself never gave, I had in mind exactly James Ross's argument in his 1992 Immaterial Aspects of Thought paper.
Yeah. Was that coming up? Did you want to?
Yeah, well, I was going to get into that. I know you were going to ask me about what happens when we die and do souls continue.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we're just kind of like, yeah, that's right. Because we divided this into one, do we have a soul? And then where we're going now is, do they continue? Right. Do we have reason to think that they survive bodily death? So I guess both of my questions really kind of pertain to that. So yeah, why don't we just, unless there's anything else you want to say about that first kind of step.
No, other than to know, I mean, I guess this is be a good place to note that, right, everything I've said up to this point would only show that there is a human soul and would not suggest anything in and of itself about what happens to the human soul when human beings die.
Right. So it could just be the case that, yeah, I agree with Chris completely. There's definitely, this aspect about us. We need this to make sense, but that doesn't mean we're all going to heaven, right?
Right.
doesn't mean that, there's any life after death. So cool. Yeah. Let's continue on.
Right. So then we could ask this question. Okay. So let's say for the reasons that, I just gave, you believe in a soul. Well, I mean, that doesn't by itself mean that it's anything but religion to think that it survives after our death. But in fact, this, is also, I think, ultimately not the case. I think we can show from philosophical considerations alone, without the aid of revelation, that our souls are such as to be able to survive our deaths. And more importantly, perhaps just as importantly, our souls are capable of surviving in such a way that they serve as the ground for the possibility of our own resurrection.
Awesome.
Right. So why would you think that? Okay. So here's, I guess, the real linchpin to this whole argument, as Aquinas makes it, at least, right? In order to figure out whether our soul could survive or not, we'd have to figure out whether our soul is the kind of thing that could exist without our body. Mm-hmm. Let's put it that way, right? We want to find out, okay, so we have a soul, but is it the kind of thing that could exist without the body? Mm-hmm. And Aquinas has this really great way of thinking about this question. He says, okay, well, I think the way to get at this question of whether the soul could exist without the body, we can ask ourselves the question of whether the soul can do anything without the body.
Yeah, which is cool. And just to kind of clarify, it's important to understand that, okay, maybe there's like a real composite here, but maybe you can't separate that composite, right?
That's right.
And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can't separate it without destroying the parts. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Aquinas' idea is, look, everything is as it does in a certain way, right? Everything is as it does. So if it can act apart from the body, if the soul can act apart from the body, Aquinas is going to think that's legitimate ground on which to conclude that the soul could exist apart from the body. Mm-hmm. And this ability to exist apart from the body, Aquinas is going to term subsistence, right? It's just a fancy way of saying that the soul isn't just a part of me, it's a thing in its own right. Mm-hmm. It would be different in this respect from, say, my hand. If I cut off my hand, something survives, but as you can tell from the fact that it no longer moves and it eventually starts rotting and so forth, it's not a hand anymore. Mm-hmm. So at least in that sense, hands are not the sort of thing that could survive being separated from me. Right. It's not subsistent in that. My hand is not subsistent in that sense. Mm-hmm. And that goes that is connected with the fact that my hand can't do anything apart from me, or apart from my body. My hand doesn't do anything without being told, what to do by my brain, and without being oxygenated by blood from my heart and so forth. And so because it can't do anything apart from my body, it also can't exist apart from my body.
There's a real dependency relationship there.
That's right. But so Aquinas thinks, however, right, that the soul's different. The soul actually does do something apart from the body, and because it does something apart from the body, it's going to be able to exist apart from the body. And what he thinks the soul does apart from the body is think and will, or and the chief action of the will, the ultimate action of the will, love. The reason, and the argument I'll use in just a moment as to why he thinks that thinking on the part of the soul is something it does apart from the body, will be slightly different than the argument that Aquinas gives, and is actually due to, as you mentioned, James Ross in a 1992 paper he writes called Immaterial Aspects of Thought. And that argument is actually really simple. It goes like this. At least some kinds of thought are absolutely determinate with respect to their content and conclusions. But nothing that is material is ever fully determinate. Therefore, thinking, at least the kinds of thinking that can be fully determinate, are not physical processes, not material operations. So what do I, first of all, I should be clear, like, okay.
What's determinate? People might think like determinism, so let's clarify terms.
What do I mean by determinate? Well, by determinate, I mean, it's basically what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the argument from vagueness. Determinacy is the opposite of vagueness, right? So something's determinate just if it's perfectly clear, at least in principle, that it's this thing and not another, okay? Right? So to get an idea of something that wouldn't be determinate, right, you can imagine, and emphasis here on the word imagine, because it can be distinct from what I mean by think. Imagine a 1,000-sided polygon, right? You will not be able to distinguish that based on your mental image of the thing from a circle, right? The circle and the 1,000-sided polygon are going to look to you, whether on a sheet of paper or in your imagination, exactly alike. You can't tell the difference between them based on the image. And what that illustrates is, in the case of like seeing it on a sheet of paper, a limitation on our vision. And in the case of being able, if I do it in my imagination, it's just a limitation on the capacity of my imagination.
Correct.
Right. But that's an example of indeterminacy, right? Like I just don't have enough mental hardware, so to speak, right, to be able to imagine something like a 1,000-sided polygon in a way that would enable me to clearly distinguish it from a circle.
Right. You can't picture think it.
Right. They're going to look exactly alike to me. And that's an example of indeterminacy, right? The line is being blurred between the circle and the 1,000-sided polygon. However, note, right, like when I actually think about, when I have the idea of, and not just the image of, a 1,000-sided polygon, it's very clearly distinct from a circle, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
conceptually, yeah.
Right, I can tell you exactly what's distinct about it, right? Like it has 1,000 sides as opposed to a circle, which really just has one side. And a curved side at that, which the 1,000-sided polygon doesn't have any curves, right? I can tell you very clearly in words and in my idea of the thing what's different about them, but the image is blurry. All right. And so what Ross is going to suggest is that, in fact, there's lots of various kinds of thought that are very much like this, where the material side of things is not going to be able to settle the question of what it is you're thinking about. But it's nevertheless very clear that you are thinking about this thing rather than this other thing. So to give another example, let's say I do an argument. I run a modus ponens argument, right? And I say, well, if A, then B. A, therefore B, right? I know with determinacy that what I've just done is modus ponens, right? But if I were to, for example, build a computer to do logical operations for me or whatever, and as it's running, I were to look at the circuits and how the electricity is running through them and so forth. Nothing about what's going on inside that computer in terms of circuits and metal and electricity makes it be the case that what the computer is doing is modus ponens as opposed to modus tollens or any other logical operation, right? It's only once somebody who's capable, something that's capable of thought, imposes meaning and interpretation on the electricity and the metal and so on, that it becomes the case that I can speak intelligibly about computers doing modus ponens or doing addition for that matter. So right, another example would be addition, right? So I suppose I want to add the numbers 53 and 37, and I add those up. What is it? 53 and 37. I add those up, and I get the answer 90, right? And that's the correct answer. Let's say, I do have a computer do the same thing, right? And again, I look on the inside, there's electricity, there's circuits, but, right, there's no addition there in itself, or not, right? Not, at least not until I come in and start putting interpretation on the physical process.
On the symbols, yeah.
On the symbols and on the very physics of what's going on inside the computer. And one way to kind of illustrate this, right, in a way that a slightly different way of illustrating this, right, is, if I were teaching a small child addition, for example, and I taught them 1 + 1 and 2 + 2 and 5 + 5 and so on, and they, let's say they get, they learn all that and they get the correct answer, and then all of a sudden, once I start teaching them how to add numbers larger than 100, they think that all the answers turn out to be 5, right? So like they get 1 + 1 right, 2 + 2 is right, 5 + 5 is 10, right? And 10 + 10 is 20, and they get that all right. But then once I get them up to 50 + 50, they say, oh, that's 5. I'm like, no, right? And I say, well, what about 87 + 92? It's like, oh, that's 5 too. And what about 123 + 294? That's 5. It would be very clear that something has gone dramatically wrong with my teaching this child addition. But note that it doesn't necessarily have to be that this child is, stupid, right? It could be that the child learned the rule wrong, right? They learned that the rule that they learned is that if I want to add two numbers together, then I find the actual sum as we normally do if the sum is less than 100, but if it's greater than 100, then the answer is 5.
Right.
That's
what does Ross call that? Quaddition or quaddition?
Well, yeah, he borrowing from Kripke, he calls that quaddition. Yeah. Right. And that's a perfectly fine rule to follow, right? There's nothing that, there's nothing like wrong with that rule, right? Now, if the child were adding, he would be adding wrong, but maybe he's not adding, right? Maybe he's doing this other thing.
Yeah, maybe he's quadding.
Maybe he's quadding. He's following this other rule altogether, right? And he'd only be wrong if he was following the same rule as I was. But if he's not following the same rule, then he might not be wrong. He might just be doing something different, right? And so Now the question can be asked, right? Well, like, how do I know that I'm not quadding, right? Well, you can say, well, I've added numbers to some of which are greater than 100, and I get the normal answer. And it's like, all right, but like, let's think about the number above which you've never added before, and there's going to be some such number for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. How do you know you'll get the answer right? How do you know that the answer you get when you add above that number will be the right answer, the normal addition answer,
and not 5, say,
and not 5, right? And you're going to say, well, I just know that if I were to do it, no matter how big the numbers got, I would still do it the right way, because I just have this like fundamental grasp on what the rule is.
This conceptual clarity, right? This determinate.
That's right.
Conceptual clarity.
And we extend that kind of understanding to others, right? Like, I assume that other people are adding as well and not quadding. I assume that there's not some magical number above which other people will start telling me that the sum of those numbers is 5, mm-hmm. right? But note that, like, I have not made that determination on the basis of like their behavior, mm-hmm. Or anything physically observable, like what's going on inside their brains or anything like that, because all of their behavior up to this point and everything physically observable about them and all the physical processes that goes on inside their brains when they add is all consistent with them quadding.
Yeah, it could be adding or quadding, right? So that's
up to this point, all the physical information I have is consistent with them quadding instead of adding, and I'd only be able to tell the difference once they hit that magical number, right? But note that, like, you can't ever settle the issue by just having them hit that magical number, because every time they hit that magical number, there might be yet another even greater number above mm-hmm. which they'll start giving me weirdo answers, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's no, the point here being, right, there's no number of like number of addition problems I can give you, or give to a computer for that matter, or where if you just do all these correctly, I can be sure that you're adding rather than quadding. Mm-hmm. Because there'll always be another addition problem I could give you where you won't get it right. Even if I gave you infinitely many addition problems, there would still be more where you could get the answer wrong the next time, or not get the answer wrong, but illustrate that you're following a different rule. Mm-hmm. And so then we have to ask, okay, well, on the basis of what do we determine that other people are adding, or that I myself am adding, or that a computer is adding rather than quadding? What's the basis for this? And if it can't be anything physical, which it can't, because all the physical processes are compatible with it being another rule that's being followed, then I have to conclude that it's something immaterial. Right. It has to be something non-physical, which accounts for it being the case that I'm following the addition rule right now when I add, rather than the quaddition rule. And that's basically the shape of the argument that Ross gives in there. Now, I should also note that Edward Fazer has a paper addressing these same kinds of issues called Kripke, Ross, and the Immaterial Aspect of Thought, where he lays out in even greater detail what Ross's argument is and what the objections to it might be and so forth. And one of the important objections to talk about would be the one where people just kind of bite the bullet and admit that we're never adding, or we're never doing modus ponens.
Right, that there is no determinate content, right? They'll just deny that. Mm-hmm.
And you see this actually long prior to Ross's writing this paper, you had certain philosophers like Quine who embrace a form of this, right? They say so for Quine, it was a matter of what he called semantic indeterminacy, right? Like he thought there would be cases where there was no fact of the matter about how to translate between different languages, for instance, because language is all a matter of rule following, and the rules don't settle what the words mean by themselves, because the rule following behaviors don't determine what the words mean. So the example he gave was like, you assume you meet somebody who speaks a foreign language you've never heard before, perhaps that nobody has ever heard before, which of course has really happened in history. People meet other people who speak a language that nobody who speaks that language has ever heard before. They point to a rabbit and utter a certain word. I forget the one that Quine uses for it. Gavagai. They point to a rabbit and say Gavagai, and you might be inclined to think, oh, okay, I guess Gavagai means rabbit in this language. But Quine points out that's actually too quick if all you have to go on is the fact that he pointed to the rabbit, because he might actually mean by Gavagai like fast rabbit, right? Because this rabbit is running fast, or he might mean undetached rabbit meat.
Or a small animal or something like that.
Or small animal or something like that. Right, and no matter how much back and forth you engage in with this guy who speaks this different language, you're never going to be able to, for sure, exclude the possibility that he actually means something slightly different by Gavagai than what you mean by rabbit. And Quine thinks that the lesson of this is to just embrace that conclusion. Like, yeah, there's just no fact of the matter about translating between languages in this way. And in fact, there's no fact of the matter about what our own words mean in our own language.
Right.
Now, the issue with this, at least when it comes to certain kinds of ways of thinking, is that they lead to really absurd conclusions, and they even undermine the objection, the biting of the bullet itself. Right. So, like, for example, if you think that I never really do modus ponens, right? Well, then all your arguments for materialism, and of course, if you don't do modus ponens, then you don't ever validly do any kind of argumentation, right? You don't ever validly argue, if you, right? Because those are all going to be determinate forms of thinking, determinate ways of inferring something from something else.
Right. And so you might just think you're doing that, but you might be doing something completely unrelated to that, which means you've really just taken down all of argument altogether.
That's right. You've destroyed the very idea of argumentative validity, of the idea that if these premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, because that is itself a determinate way of thinking. And if you can't be sure you're thinking that way rather than some other way, then you can't be sure that the way you're thinking is a valid way of thinking. A valid argument.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and it seems self-defeating in this sense, and you're probably just going to say this, that in order to say that you're not doing that depends on you knowing what that is that you're denying, right? So
right, yeah. So right, one way this ends up being self-defeating is you can't deny that I have a certain determinate. You can't deny that you have a certain determinate concept without having the determinate concept, right?
Right. Yeah.
In order to deny you have it, you have to know what it is. But if you know what it is, you have it. And the other way this ends up being self-defeating is if, in fact, you can't ever reason validly, or know that you're reasoning validly, then all the arguments against the existence of the soul are no good. We couldn't know that they're valid. And because we couldn't know that they're valid, there's no reason to accept the conclusion.
Right.
Phaser goes into even greater detail about other ways in which this ends up being self-defeating. But I recommend,
I will link that paper in the show notes. I know he's got it online. I think he also has a talk on that. And be patient with this, because I understand if this is the first time you've ever hopped into a discussion like this, you'll probably be Like, what the heck are these guys talking about? But when I first studied this argument, I'm like, that's a good argument. That's a
Yeah.
good argument. Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons I really like Ross's argument is I think it gets away it it gets away from some of the uh, scholastic metaphysical uh, presuppositions that causes contemporary philosophers to get hung up on the details of that instead of looking at the central point of that I think Ross is really extracting here for us.
Yeah, which it just sidesteps some things that are not entirely germane to the argument itself.
Yeah. So notice, like, nothing we've said here, right, has ever used the word form or anything like that. It hasn't made any Aristotelian presuppositions.
Right. So it stands independently of the other ones, but in support of them. So this argument, if it goes through, not only would support the claim like, well, since it can do something without the body, it could survive without the body, but it would also just show that there is, again, it would just go back and re-demonstrate everything you just argued for already, saying there is this immaterial aspect of us as well.
Right. And then, in addition to the self-refutation bits, I should also note, like, it just leads to biting the bullet also leads to just wildly implausible conclusions, such as, for example, that all of mathematics is impossible, because all of that is determinate content, right? You have to know that 3 times 3 equals 9 and not 9.00000001. Right, or 8.9999999, right? If you write, if you even in 3rd grade, right? If you tell your math teacher that 3 times 3 equals 8.999999999, you did something wrong, right? It's not that; it's exactly 9, right? And so and all of pure mathematics rests on, right, that kind of determinacy. So if that's just impossible, then it turns out that mathematics is impossible.
Right.
But if mathematics like that is impossible, then our probably our best physical theories don't work either.
Right.
It turns out. So a lot of natural science just comes crumbling down.
Yeah.
So there's a huge cost to denying this, and it ends up being self-refuting.
And you can't even coherently get it done. Yeah, no, this is a great example of I think kind of a hidden gem argument that maybe not a lot of people have heard before that I think is really powerful. So I had 2 other things, Chris, that I wanted to get your opinion on, and I don't know if you have any other arguments for this, but I'd love to hear them if so for this stage. But it's something that kind of I've done a fair amount of research into, and it seems to offer some empirical support to the philosophical arguments. Like, hey, if there is, a human soul that survives bodily death, might we find some like evidence of that in a broadly empirical sense? And what I'm hinting at, what I'm getting towards, are phenomena such as near-death experiences and terminal lucidity.
Okay.
Do you factor that at all into your research? If we want to just shove that off to the side, we totally can. But
I don't necessarily want to shove that off to the side. Because I actually don't think it's good. I don't want to shove it off to the side. I don't want to ignore it. I want to actually positively reject it.
Really interesting.
Yeah. So. Well, I mean, maybe you can tell me more about what you mean by terminal lucidity, but at least let me start with near-death experiences.
Yeah.
So one reason, and you may very well know more about the research in this area than I do, but knowing what I do know about it, I don't see any reason in the evidence that's offered for thinking that the naturalistic explanations of near-death experiences are wrong. Now, I should note in saying that, like, this is an empirical question, right?
Right.
If it turns out that the naturalistic explanations just don't stand up scientifically to the data, then I'm happy to revise my views on this. One reason at least given what I know at this point about near-death experiences, that I would want to reject those as arguments for the immortality of the soul is, well, twofold. One is that I don't think anybody should be hitching their wagon to empirical arguments for conclusions for which we have
demonstrative philosophical.
Yeah, that's right.
100%
because then what happens is you get, you have your new if you end up being wrong about the empirical stuff, it ends up being a stumbling block, if you will, right? To other people who may have otherwise found your case persuasive.
Right. So let me acknowledge that. I think that that's absolutely right. Is I never lead in with that stuff. My belief in the soul comes down to everything that we've just talked about, and not just arguments for the soul, but the arguments for God too. Like what I believe are demonstrative philosophical arguments. And I kind of look at near-death experiences probably in the same way that I look at arguments from physical fine-tuning. I think it might add some icing to the cake, but we still have the cake even without the icing, and the cake is more than good enough for me. And I guess what I would you go ahead. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, the other reason is just this though, that by definition, what the kind of experiences that I have near death are not experiences that I have after death. Right. That's in the definition of near death.
Yeah.
Now, it should be noted that what I mean by after death, we got to be careful about what we mean by death here, right?
Which is a messy philosophical subject. Absolutely.
Yeah, right. We don't want to just say it's cardiac arrest or something like that, and we don't want to say it's anything you can come back from, right? Because if you say that, then we don't just have, arguably at least, we don't just have near-death experiences. We have after-death experiences that people alive now could tell us about.
Yeah.
Right? So what we mean by, so I think it's kind of implicit in the very idea of a near-death experience that the death that we're near when we're talking about a near-death experience is the sort from which there's no natural way of coming back. Right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so once we get straight on that, right, that what the relevant kind of death is, then even if the naturalistic explanations turn out well, let's put it this way, no matter, the fact that the experiences exist by itself, I think, proves nothing, right? No matter what the explanation ends up being, because what you have by definition is a near-death experience, not an after-death experience. So that by itself doesn't show anything about what happens to the soul after death.
Right.
It could, it could be, those might be interesting demonstrations that there is a soul, for example. Yeah. But it doesn't prove immortality because, as the very name tells us.
Yeah, maybe you just go on for 100 more years or something like that. Yeah, I could.
You haven't, or not even 100 years, right? It could be something that you experience just a moment right before death, but nevertheless, no matter how close you get to the point of death, the fact that you're having experiences 1 second or 1/10 of a second or 1/10000000th of a second before death, by itself doesn't tell us anything about whether you could continue having experiences after death.
Yeah. So, okay. So I see where you're coming from, and a lot of it hinges on, and I think I agree with that, but let me throw this out there just to get your thoughts, and we can move on. Cause I know this isn't the main thing of the debate. So what I would say when I look at the research, well, first off, I would want to say I think a lot of these, especially if you go into Barnes and Noble and grab something out of the clearance New Age bin, are
the,
are
or
are
the,
are
the
clearly
metaphysics,
fabricated, right?
the
Yeah,
metaphysics section.
right. Yeah, like are clearly fabricated, are clearly hoaxes. I think that there's many natural explanations that could be given for probably a lot of these. But I think when you look at some of the peer-reviewed research, like in the Lancet or some of these other studies, there's some that I do think exhaust naturalistic explanations, right? So when you have, flat EEG, fixed and dilated pupils, and people not only continue to have experiences at all with little to no brain activity, but they're veridical experiences. And I think it's the
Right.
veridical experiences that cannot be plausibly explained on a sort of naturalistic worldview, right? Where people have full sensorial knowledge of events that are happening, not just in the room, but other areas, right, of conversations that are then independently investigated by researchers and parties. I don't see a good naturalistic explanation for those.
The veracity is definitely the most that is the most impressive part, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Like if we can show that, or I mean, I think this would be the gold standard, and I mean, claims to this effect have been made, but again, I'm not super familiar.
But let me press. I love how skeptical you are of this, right? This goes to show that the kind of standard that Chris sets. And that's awesome, right? It's like, hey, Chris is a religious guy. He's not just jumping at like this indicates my worldview. Let me take it in, right? No, you're really pressing scrutiny here. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interject.
That's fine. Thank you. So I mean, right. So here's what I think would be like really strong evidence that would really put naturalist against a wall with respect to near-death experiences would be something like the following, right? Like I know that near-death experiences of this sort have been claimed. I don't know what the research shows about their reproducibility and veracity. But right, so if someone who is clearly showing no brain activity, is otherwise completely incapacitated and in cardiac arrest, would be able to have veridical experiences of something that even a fully alert, healthy person in that same location would not be able to know about. That would be, I think, like the gold standard in terms of near-death experience evidence for a soul. But I get now that so if that exists, and if that's something that has been scientific put to scientific scrutiny, then I think that there is something there that naturalists need to contend with for sure. Right. So, and I know claims like that have been made of like people in near-death experiences knowing what the topic of conversation was between two people down the hall that even a healthy, alert person would not be able to hear at that distance.
Right. Locations of surgical instruments in different rooms, like things like that, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. So now let me, having said that, come back to additional reasons I have for skepticism about this. Actual, I think, positive metaphysical reasons I have for thinking that something like that can't happen. One of which is that for me to say have veridical experiences of something at a distance by way of my soul, for example, by way, and emphasis here on like by way of my soul, would presumably require without divine assistance. Let's rule out that I'm having some kind of divine assistance.
Yeah,
would presumably require some kind of separation between my soul and my body, for my soul to be in that other location and have the relevant experiences. But that kind of separation between my soul and my body is precisely what I take to be, for metaphysical reasons, the event of death. So in fact, what we would be dealing with there would not be a near-death experience, but an after-death experience. Now, that's of course not to say that it's outright impossible, because I had said in the absence of divine assistance. So
that's really interesting, because I've actually always thought that near-death experiences require exactly that.
Right. Yeah. So if we're talking about the assistance of God, then lots of things are, lots of other things are possible.
Yeah. I legit just think they're miracles. That's my position on it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So if they're miracles, then we're in a whole new realm. And even there, right? Like, I mean, in the Catholic tradition, of course, right? We have lots of claims of bilocation, for example, on the part of saints like Padre Pio, that involves some kind of they're I mean, my best take on it is it's some kind of miracle by which God allows that person to have the relevant experiences as if they were there,
right?
And for other people to have experiences as if that person was there, and of course God could be doing that with dying persons for all anybody knows.
Yeah.
And I think that is what would start to be suggested if we were to find out, for example, right, that people who are very close to death are having veridical experiences of events at a distance where even healthy people would not be able to pick up, on that information using normal senses.
Yeah.
Right. So
that's cool that you bring that up, because I've always figured that this demonstrates a trans-physical aspect of us, but that it probably requires divine assistance. That's kind of where I am after. Yeah.
If we're talking about so I mean, I think what that would ultimately boil down to is like God is allowing this person to have the experiences at a distance without the soul actually coming apart from the body, because that would constitute death.
And that would actually, I think, accord with the kind of physical data, because one of the issues with near-death experiences is not everyone has them, right? And like the physical circumstances can be like almost identical. And so you're like, well, if this is a physical explanation, we would expect it more frequently, and we don't. But if it's some type of, and I'm sorry, I don't want to totally get away from our primary points, but this is just super fascinating to me. But I think we actually substantially agree on the point now that we've.
And yeah, I mean, I guess where I start to get really skeptical is it seems like everybody has a story, about some relative who saw a light one time when they had a heart attack.
Right.
And that kind of thing, I'm very skeptical about, because, just general experiences of seeing a light or even of seeing loved ones feeling warmth that people report, where there's no outside veridical no outside check we could perform on veracity, I mean, I think those ought to be treated with suspicion. And I mean, and even the ones with veracity, I mean, so you suggest miracle in that case, but even the miracle, I start off rather suspicious about, because I'm like, well, why? Why would God be interested in letting people who are near death hear conversations down the hall? One, like, what's important about that at all? Maybe it's a way of God illustrating the reality of the spirit to us. But at least for that person, it doesn't seem like it's terribly important. And especially given how close they are to death, it seems like much other things are much more important. There is a supernatural destiny, at that time.
And then we start getting into like divine psychology and all this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, no. Yeah. So the points that I think and I think we do agree on this at large strokes, and it probably would just come down to further empirical investigation, if anything else. But the main point I want to emphasize, which I really strongly agree with you, is that all these near-death experiences could totally just be proven, bunk, and it would change, my opinion, zero on the soul, right?
Absolutely.
So it's just a separate thing, and I wouldn't. Even when I studied them, kind of before I was even Catholic, whatever. Like, I always found those interesting. I never pursued it really in depth. It was the philosophical arguments that really got me.
Right.
And then I'm like, all right, well, let me go back and look at those near-death experiences.
It's worth noting, of course, that this is the church's attitude as well. the way that the church thinks about the immortality of the soul and other things that can be proven by reason alone is to rest on the philosophical proofs, and not to get bogged down in alleged empirical evidence for that thing.
Yeah.
And I think the church has been very wise in approaching questions in that way.
Mother Church, in her wonderfully infinite wisdom, we can always rely on that. So, okay, cool. Well, we'll just bracket all that off then for the remainder. Thank you for that diversion. That was super fascinating. Sure. But getting back then to the points, taking off from the Ross's argument that you just trotted out. What else you got for us there?
All right. So yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap up the way that argument goes. Right. I mean, what I said about Ross is supposed to illustrate that there are some processes, some instances of thinking, some acts of the intellect on the part of human beings that are immaterial, right? Precisely because they are instances of rule following that no physical process or any sequence of physical processes could be sufficient to be an instance of. And if that's the case, and we have such processes going on within us in our own determinate thought, then we are things that carry on some non-physical processes. And of course, since they're non-physical processes, they can't be happening in the body. They have to be happening in the soul. And if the soul has activities like that it carries on wholly apart from the body, then the principle that I started off with, and which is defended by Aquinas, right, kicks in. It does something apart from the body, therefore it can exist apart from the body. Because for Aquinas, right, things are as they do, right? When we see that a thing can act apart from the body, we find out that it can exist apart from the body.
Right. So action follows being, according to
action follows being, right? And one way to think about that, right, the idea is it's kind of like an a fortiori principle, right? It's harder for a thing to act apart from the body than it is for the thing to exist apart from the body, because action involves greater perfection than just being.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So if it can, and Ross's argument seems to show that it can act apart from the body, therefore it can be apart from the body. And in fact, given that it can be apart from the body, we can know that it's subsistent, and because it's immaterial, we know that it's not subject to the same kind of disintegration that the body is subject to.
Same kind of decomposition that the material things are. Yeah.
Right. So not only can it survive apart from the body, but it will, because there's nothing, because it's immaterial, there's nothing that can naturally destroy it. And so it will survive the body. It not just can, but it will.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I hope people listening in, if this is the first time you've heard this, like, notice, like, we've brought religion in here and there, but we didn't use any parts of Revelation to support this argument.
Right. None of the arguments I've given so far have relied on any principles that we find out about from Revelation. I mean, as you said, we've talked about connections with Revelation, but I've not relied on it anywhere.
Yeah. So I just want to emphasize that because we're just doing some pure armchair thinking here, and this is awesome stuff. So then this is interesting because I think I don't know if you had anything other you wanted to add to that, Chris, but your contention, if I understand it right, is that our souls survive death, but maybe we don't.
Right.
Right. And that makes people go like, what? What is
yeah.
Yeah.
So the Cartesian and Lockean idea, right, is that we are our souls, right? And the relationship between the soul and the body is, I should say, Descartes, Locke, and Plato all kind of have
And
this.
and in contemporary scene, I think we would group Swinburne in there. He just had his recent book. I have it right
Swinburne,
back on the shelf, right, where that's what he affirms, that I am just fundamentally a substance that's capable of thinking, right?
Right, and importantly, I am not essentially my body. My body is not an essential part of me in any way, shape, or form. And that's Plato's view. That's Descartes' view.
This is the Swinburne book that affirms that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in a certain way that I'll illustrate, that I'll talk about later, it's the Lockean view. It's the kind of view that fits best with Locke's idea that personal identity consists in psychological continuity.
Right.
But it's not. It's neither Aquinas's view of the human person nor the church's.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. I mean, so the way that Aquinas characterizes the Plato / Descartes kind of view, right, is that I'm just my soul and I'm riding around in my body like a pilot in a ship.
Yeah, I think what was that movie, The Men in Black, with the little alien riding around? Yeah,
right. With the alien in the skull of the I guess the human suit.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That it's something like that. Obviously, that's somewhat of a caricature, but right, that my body isn't a part of me. It's something through which I interact with the world, and that the real me is just my soul.
Correct.
Now, there are, I think, a number of reasons to reject this view. Both philosophical and theological, actually. I'll start with the philosophical ones. So just from a very, on a very common sense kind of view, what this would entail, for example, is that I don't actually do any of the things that my body does, right? I don't walk, my body walks. I don't eat, my body eats. I don't play sports, my body plays sports,
Right.
I don't kiss somebody, my body kisses that person's body for me, right? And of course, it's true on substance dualism that I cause my body to do those things. But because my body is not part of me, or at least it's not essentially part of me, right? It's at best in a very weak sense true to say that I do those things. But of course, common sense tells us that I do all those things, right? I do all the bodily things. And I not only do them, but I do them in a way that's intimately tied up with all the other things that I do.
Right. It's not my body that kisses my wife. I kiss my wife. But
That's
we could also kind of turn this into, I guess, a more severe ethical consequence, where it's like any attack against my body is really then just a property crime. Like I wasn't abused.
That's right.
I wasn't raped. Somebody just attacked my property, right?
That's right. So actually, right. I mean, I think this actually does lead to like these kind of extreme libertarian views of like your body is the kind of thing that you own. And because you own it, perhaps you can sell it. You can sell yourself into slavery. You can do whatever you want with your body. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It leads to these kinds of extreme libertarian views that I think are very weak. Now, you mentioned ethics. One of the arguments against this view that I deploy in my own dissertation, and which I believe is actually original with me, is that this would lead us, if we adopted this view, we would not be able to hold the Catholic position on euthanasia. And here's the reason why. So Catholic doctrine is quite okay with amputations. My hand doesn't work anymore and it's all mangled and I'm in a lot of pain and everything, there's nothing in Catholic doctrine that forbids me from, or a doctor from cutting it off of me. Okay, it relieves my pain. It didn't really work anymore anyway. It was all mangled. It was no good to me. Cut it off. And the way that gets justified is, right, a kind of principle of the whole, a principle of totality. I'm better off without it, given what happened, right? And so I can cut off to save the rest of me, right? And Aquinas explicitly approves that. There's, and the church is obviously fine with that. It's obviously not contrary to Catholic bioethics to have an amputation done. But if we take the kind of Plato / Descartes Cartesian view of the body as not an essential part of me,
sort of a meat vehicle,
right? Then we can start to say the same things about the whole body that we say about my hand. Well, I get really old. My body doesn't work well anymore. I'm in a lot of pain. Wouldn't it be better for me if I were to, so to speak, cut my body off?
Yeah, just amputate your entire body. Yeah.
Right. So interestingly, now Edward Feser does not share my view. The view that I'm getting to is corruption. It's called corruptionism. The view that human beings cease to exist at their death. Edward Feser, who very adamantly disagrees with me about this, I actually cite him in my work on this argument because he has a chapter in it's the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. He has a chapter there on Aquinas's view of the soul, where he actually speaks. He calls death a, quote, full body amputation, end quote. So he talks about it in explicitly these terms. But what he never considers, at least in that chapter, is the ethical dimensions of thinking about death as a full body amputation. Because if you are able to really think about it that way, where, right, the body, you can cut off the whole body, and I'm still there, just with only my soul left as part of me, but I'm still there. If it's really possible to think about death in that way, then as a full body amputation, then we have to confront this ethical question of whether such amputations are permissible, right? And in fact, on my view at least, it ends up being impossible once you adopt this kind of view to say where the line is supposed to be between the permissible amputations and the allegedly impermissible full body amputations, i.e. euthanasia, right? Like when somebody causes this full body amputation for medical reasons, we call it euthanasia. But we Catholics and many other Christians, and I think all people who have seriously thought about the issue carefully on the moral, non-revealed moral grounds alone, should want to reject the permissibility of euthanasia.
Yeah, I agree.
It constitutes the intrinsic evil of deliberately killing an innocent person. But I think once we give up on the idea that the body is an essential part of the human person, we're no longer able to draw that bright line distinction between permissible amputations of parts of the body to save the whole and amputation of the whole body from me, because for the very same kind of reasons, right? Because the body doesn't work well anymore. It's causing me a lot of pain, and so on. Those are the kind of reasons on which you'd amputate my hand. So why can't you amputate the body?
Yes.
Right. So I deploy that kind of argument in my dissertation. I'm quite happy about that argument. My advisor Alex also adamantly disagrees with me about this issue.
Good.
But
Yeah,
even,
fighting against Alex Proust and Ed Fazer, not flimsy competition there. So good for you.
but I think Alex has been Alex really likes these kinds of arguments where you start with ethical premises and end up with metaphysical conclusions.
Yes. Yeah, I noticed that in his work. He does like to toss those out a lot. Yeah.
So he was, I think, of all the arguments I've given for my view, I think this is the one he finds most impressive.
Interesting.
Right. So I think that's the conclusion of that argument, if everything I've said so far is right, is that my body is not an accidental part of me. It's not something, it's not a part that I can lose.
Mm-hmm.
It's an essential part of me.
Right.
And what we have to accept, if that is right, is that when I die and my body ceases to be a part of me, I cease to be, period.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, I have other arguments for this, right? So the basic fundamental argument is not the one I just gave, but a much simpler one, an argument that I think Aquinas endorses and has to endorse given his overall metaphysics, right? Where my body is the matter of me, my soul is the form of me, and by definition for Aquinas, substantial corruption, the destruction of a substance, consists in the form coming apart from the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And also, by definition for Aquinas, death consists in the separation of the soul from the body.
Yeah.
But if my body is my matter and my soul is my form, and my death is the coming apart of the soul from the body, then my death is the coming apart of the soul of the matter from the form, the matter from the substantial form, and therefore constitutes the substantial corruption of me, and therefore constitutes the end of my existence.
Right.
Now, for the same reason that it would be the end of the existence of the tree, right? When I burn it down, I burn down the tree. Why does the tree cease to exist?
Mm-hmm.
Because the form of the tree, its soul, has been separated from its matter and replaced with the form of ash.
Yes.
By the efficient causal power of the fire.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now, and that's Aquinas' general story of how all substances go out of existence. Yeah. Their substantial form ends up, by some causal story or another, getting separated from their matter, and that's what causes that constitutes the substances ceasing to exist, and one or more substances beginning to exist from that same matter.
Yeah, awesome. Chris, real quick, do you mind if we take like a 2-minute bathroom break? This coffee has just run completely through me.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, bathroom break concluded. Chris, you might set the record here. I mean, I went for a while with Gavin Kerr last time, but this could be an all-time podcast length. But
yeah, dude, it's up to you. I mean, whenever you want to, if you've got up or whatever.
No, if you've got the time, I love it, and I know I've heard a lot of great feedback from people who enjoy the depth of these conversations. So, and look, people can break it up over a couple commutes. You don't have to.
Right.
I'm gonna put the burden on them. I'm not gonna.
Right. Yeah. No. That's fine with me. Yeah. No. I'm happy to be doing public facing philosophical work like this, because ultimately I'm in philosophy to help people come closer to God. So this is what it's. This is for me really these kind of conversations with you and other people who help me get my work out to the public in general and my fellow Catholics is more important than, getting stuff published in journals where nobody ever reads it.
Yeah, the academic exchanges. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, because I feel exactly the same way. I feel like, man, there's so many brilliant, great Catholics out there who just represent the faith so well, make so many good arguments that nobody knows about. So like, I'm gonna drag them on this podcast, come hell or high water, right? But with you, it wasn't dragging. You're just so this is super cool. I appreciate it, Chris.
Sure,
really do. So okay, so we left at kind of Aquinas's account of what you're calling corruption. So
right. So I guess what I want to emphasize about that is, like, this is right, this is part and parcel of what we kind of bought into when we bought into hylomorphism, right? Go all the way back to the beginning of our discussion when we first started talking about reasons to believe in a soul. I said, well, you can kind of get the soul for cheap if you just buy into the whole hylomorphic picture, right? But now I guess we're seeing what some may consider to be a cost of having bought into that picture is we've also bought into Aristotle and Aquinas's hylomorphic story about how substances come into and go out of existence.
Yeah.
And I think that story ultimately leads us to conclude, contrary to many people's intuitions, that human persons do not immediately survive their deaths. Now,
yeah, if I can just real quick, because you say a cost or an intuition, and I have to say, actually, your account actually kind of jives with my intuitions. And what intuitions would those be? Right. It would be the intuitions that there's something grotesque about death, right?
Yeah,
rather than the intuition that you're just relocating somewhere else, right? There seems to be something grotesque about it, right?
Something, I mean, something that is, I should say, something that is as dark as it gets, so to speak, about death, right? Like, there's a reason we fear death above all things, in a natural way, at least. Once we start talking about the supernatural, we find out there's things to be feared more than death. But at least before we start talking about the supernatural, on the natural level, we fear death above all things, and that's right and proper. And I think what that matches up with my view, insofar as my view is one on which death takes from us the greatest, the most fundamental good we have, our being. Views on which death is merely, a full body amputation, to use Edward Fazer's terminology, don't, I think, fully capture that the evil and darkness of death. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say it jives with your intuitions, because one of the reasons I ended up switching my dissertation topic to this and writing on this is because it seems like it's such, everybody seems to have nobody seems to be indifferent to the issue. Everybody thinks this is an interesting question, and they have strong reactions one way or the other. They're like, yes, your view is obviously correct, fits with all my intuitions, or no, your view is horrible, and possibly heretical, this, that, and the other thing. And so it gets strong reactions one way or the other, which is something I've really enjoyed about defending the view.
Yeah, well, if you're not being especially controversial, then what's the point, right?
Right. So I do want to revisit another reason for thinking that my view. So one thing that I think, another piece of theological doctrine, I think, another piece of theological, a theological datum that I think fits well with my view, is the church's rejection of docetism, right? That Christ's body wasn't real; it was just something like a phantasm, and that and that his sufferings, therefore, were merely apparent and not real. The rejection of corruptionism, right, or the rejection, at least, of what entails corruptionism, namely that my body is an essential part of me, kind of implies something like docetism for everybody. It's docetism for everybody, right? It seems like you're a physical thing, but it turns out that's not real. That's not the real you.
Yes.
It's really just not a phantasm, but like a phantasm. It merely appears to be part of you, and that when you suffer or do anything else that requires a body, it's not really you. Essentially, it's something to which you're accidentally united.
Right.
And we don't want to say that about Christ. We shouldn't want to say that about ourselves. And so we should adopt, I think, my view on which, right, the body is an essential part of the human person. Now, I should say, of course, my view is not without its theological difficulties. And I do want to note some of those and address them briefly. One of which is that I think it actually will not fit well with the it doesn't fit well with the beliefs of many common people in the pews, so to speak, who think,
is that a problem?
No. Well, I mean,
there's a lot of common beliefs in the pews that I would gladly reject.
Well, right. I mean, well, let me put it this way. So it wouldn't just not fit well with the common view, like the views of the common person in the pews today. I wouldn't worry so much about that because unfortunately, right, there are many views among Catholics in the pews today that are outright heretical.
Yeah.
But in fact, it doesn't fit well even historically. With like, I think the common Catholic man's view from the pew of like what happens when we die. So even putting aside issues about, the state of Catholic education in the late 20th and early 21st century, there's a, historical worry there. And even to put that same kind of worry in even sharper relief, right, it doesn't fit well with the church's, not the church's teaching. I think it fits fine with the church's teaching, but it doesn't fit so well with like, with her, with classic spiritual treatises that talk about death and preparing for death and what happens at death, with the church's great preaching and so forth, the way that we talk about death. And in particular, it doesn't fit well with what we typically think about the doctrine of purgatory for some reasons that I'll get to in a minute. Before I get to that, I want to just clarify, I am, because I should have clarified this earlier, I am not suggesting that we stop existing at our death and never come back. I'm not suggesting that death is the absolute end of human beings. I am only suggesting that we cease to exist until the resurrection. And I'm sure you know that, but I want to clarify that for your listeners who, up to this point, may be scandalized by thinking that I deny the immortality of the person in general, which I don't. It's right. It's limited to this very specific time, finite amount of time, right, between death and the resurrection, right? The question is.
So I guess, and sorry if I interjected too soon here, but would your position allow for some divinely assisted interim state?
Well, okay. Let me just parse that out for a second. I'm not denying an interim state. I'm not denying the existence of an interim state, and I'm not even denying that. I'm certainly not denying that my soul exists in the interim state.
Right.
All I'm denying is that I exist in the interim state. Now, what if you're asking? Well, with divine assistance, could I exist in the interim state? Well, I mean, that would amount to either like. No, it's metaphysical, because I think it ultimately ends up being metaphysically impossible. Not even God could do it.
Yeah. So let me clarify what I meant there. And I guess what I really need first would be from you of what, and this is fascinating to me because a lot of what you've explained, it makes sense. So now I'm trying to think through some of these consequences because I haven't read your dissertation, obviously. So like, what is there an experience? Do we have experiences in this interim?
Right,
That's kind of
okay.
what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah. Right. So let me, let me just finish clarifying that, and then I'll talk about experiences.
Cool.
And how that connects with purgatory. Right. Could God somehow make me persist through the interim state? Well, no, because by definition, the interim state is supposed to be a state in which I'm separated from the body. And if my body is essentially part of me, then not even God can make me exist apart from the body any more than right, any more than God could
make a circle exist without a circumference or something like
right,
that.
right,
Yeah.
right, make anything exist without what's essential to it.
Right.
And Aquinas himself is very clear, like, yeah, no, that's not even God can make things exist without what's essential to them.
Mhm.
Now, so what would like, if God were to somehow, so I mean, what God making me exist in the interim state would basically amount to would be either preventing my death in the first place or resurrecting me, which he will eventually do. But by definition, the interim state is supposed to refer to the time between my death and when he resurrects me.
Right.
So yeah, I think the answer to that is no, not even with divine assistance.
Yeah.
But okay, so now the reason it clashes with the view from the pew, so to speak, and with the church's spiritual tradition and homiletic tradition, is because all of those sources of theological information tell us, seem to report to us that I'm going to be having some kind of experiences in the interim state. And not only that, but that I'm going to be having experiences in the interim state that I will really either really enjoy if they're good, or really dislike if it's purgatory or hell. Now, my view doesn't really run into any significant issues with talking about experiences, and if what we're talking about is heaven or hell, because really there all you're talking about is a delay, right? If my soul goes to heaven, eventually I'm going to heaven, and there's a delay. If my soul goes to hell, I'm going to hell, and all there really is a delay. Where my view ends up running into I guess its biggest objection is when we talk about purgatory.
Right.
And the reason for that is because, according to Catholic doctrine, right, purgatory does not only last, worst case scenario, until the resurrection. And after the resurrection, there is no more purgatory. Everybody who's in purgatory until the resurrection goes to heaven at that point.
Right. And just to be clear, this is only going to be an objection for obviously all it's going to mean something to all Catholics, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
If
Catholics, but there's Protestants nowadays who do accept purgatory. Increasingly number of them, actually, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually purgatory has been the particular Catholic doctrine that's probably gained the most ground among Protestants over the past several decades. Lots of number of Protestants who actively defend it now.
Right.
But what this would imply is that I never go to purgatory. And the reason for that is, right, I don't exist in the interim state, and purgatory is an interim state only affair.
Right.
And so it entails that the only things that ever go to purgatory are souls, not me, not any other human person.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that, is certainly going to clash with, not mesh well with the church's spiritual tradition is, and homiletic tradition and the view from the pew, is that all of those sources of information, of theological information, seem to report that I go to purgatory, and seem to report that I suffer in purgatory for the temporal debts due to my sins, and that I long to be delivered from purgatory, and that if somebody gains an indulgence on my behalf, that I am the one who is delivered from purgatory,
right,
and so on. And most importantly, like, right, it would. Right. I mean, one of the things that those sources of theological information tell me is that purgatory is something to be feared. I should live my life now in such a way as to avoid having to go to purgatory. But if it's not me who's going, it seems like it's not to be feared so much.
Right.
Why should I care? Why should I care whether my soul goes to purgatory if it's not me?
Yeah. It's like just sending a suit through the wash or something like that.
Right. Well, right. And it,
Crude, horribly crude analogy, but so there they are.
right. Or it's like, what I've likened it to is the children's novel, The Whipping Boy, about which is a story about a poor pauper boy who is designated as the prince's whipping boy. Now, the reason for that is the prince misbehaves, but the prince's person is royal, and therefore may not be, no one may lay violent hands upon him. And so he when he misbehaves, his whipping boy is whipped on his behalf.
Right.
And so what this would seem to suggest, right, is something like my soul is my whipping boy.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to purgatory on my behalf, but it's not me, and I don't have those experiences. So why should I? So why should I care?
Right.
And I will admit that, yeah, that's certainly the gravest problem for my view.
So real quick, if I can just compound the issues, because I'm going to love to see your response to this, but it seems like St. Paul wants to affirm an interim state as well, right? Like an active interim state.
Are you talking about the passage where he says, he longs to be dissolved?
Exactly. Like there's kind of this dilemma. It's like, oh man, it will be grotesque to be in the interim state, but it's still better because I'm with Christ there. But like, it'd be kind of ideal if I never had to do that. Like Christ just came back right now. Right. So right. And you can clarify that any way you want, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if that particular passage by itself gives me much reason to worry. I mean, because I take it that, what St. Paul is saying there is compatible with there being some kind of delay involved between his death and when he gets to be with the Lord.
Sure.
But I mean, I think everything I've said up to this point is problem enough. And this is part of what also got me interested in the project, because, it seems almost as if the church has been speaking out of both sides of her mouth, insofar as she has been affirming since the very beginning the importance of the body, the essentiality of the body to the human person,
mm-hmm.
and so on, while at the same time saying that purgatory is something to be feared. It's going to be you who goes there. And it's going to be you who suffers there.
Yeah.
And your loved ones may be there, and you should, out of charity, pray for them, mm-hmm. and seek to gain indulgences on their behalf. These are all things the church has told us, but dogmatically and in her systematic theology, she's told us what human nature is like. And she has endorsed, I think, at least implicitly, Aquinas's view of human nature, which leads to this result. And so there's a real tension here in the things that the church has been telling us. Her dogmatics and systematic theology, and what she tells us about human anthropology, leads us to corruptionism, to the view that human persons cease to exist at their death. And while at the same time, what she says about purgatory and the spiritual life, and what she says in her homilies and so forth, seems to suggest the opposite. The opposite being survivalism, that I do survive during the interim state. Right. And to my knowledge, I've done a fair amount of research on this, on the theological side of this. Now, not exhaustive, but a fair amount of research. The church never addresses this tension, ever, anywhere.
Yeah. Which makes your project especially cool, right? Because this isn't like something that's new through Catholic history. So there's been tensions like this before, and then people work them out, right? So that's kind of exciting, actually.
Yeah. So part of why I'm super excited about this project is because it's not just a philosophical project; it's also a theological one, and I think I actually am the first Catholic theologian to explicitly address this tension in the church's tradition. Now there's there's lots of things that come really close. So like part of what makes this really weird, is in my reading of the theological tradition, is there's lots of theologians who seem to be in books that have imprimaturs and nihil obstat explicitly endorsing corruptionism. But they don't seem to take any note of the issues that I just talked about.
Sure.
They don't seem to have any appreciation for the tension that this view stands in with the church's spiritual tradition.
Yeah. So and I'm not a trained theologian. I'm a studious amateur at best when it comes to theology. But I guess maybe some of my initial questions, and I'm going to ask you what your solution is. If you have a solution to this yet, we obviously want to hear it. But just one, I guess, would be trying to get conceptual clarity about what exactly purgatory entails. Another idea for me or question would be, again, a matter of divine assistance. Okay, maybe God can't cause me, but could he give me some experiences, for example, or give my soul? So, and then I'm already kind of leaning against that now that I think about that a little bit more.
Now, no, I am going to say something about the nature of purgatory, and I definitely do want to say something about that. But I want to actually read into the record, so to speak, some of these modern affirmations of corruptionism from some theological texts for the benefit of your readers who at this point may think that I'm completely crazy and standing in diametric opposition to Catholic tradition. And I guarantee you some of your listeners who are listening to this right now are thinking that right now.
Now, let me also just say this, Chris, and we'll kind of maybe bridge a gap here too, because we started off very philosophical, and now we're into theology largely as well.
Well, we're right? into. I mean, I think we're still in the philosophical insofar as I think my conclusion is a philosophical one, and I think my argument, most of my arguments are philosophical ones. I think this is a conclusion we can reach on the basis of reason alone, but I would be, it would be grossly negligent of me, I guess, as a scholar, to ignore the theological tension that exists there.
Yeah, especially because it's here kind of, I think about it, right? Like I have good reason to accept this, and this, and so then I have good reason to accept this conclusion here, right, on the philosophical side. But then I also have really good reason to think that Catholicism is true, and Catholicism teaches this, and now I have this good reason. So we have good reasons, we would argue, at least, to accept both of these things. But now there seems to be at least a superficial, maybe there's a substantial tension, but at least a superficial tension here that we need to spend some time working through. Right? Cool. Yep.
And to go back to what I was saying, like I guarantee some of your listeners are going to think that I'm somehow opposing the tradition. I'm not really Catholic. Maybe I'm a heretic. And the reason I know some of your thinkers, some of your listeners are thinking that right now is because I've had people tell me to my face that this is the case. Priests have told me to my face that this is if not heretical, if not heretical, then very then at least like offensive to pious ears, if you will.
Sure.
Now, I am extremely confident that they're all wrong, and in fact, when I explain the view in greater detail, their opposition to the view tends to soften considerably.
Tends to dwindle, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I actually do think there's theological problems with denying my view, but I want to be very clear about what the view is, and then, like I said, I want to just show that I'm far from alone in holding it, and as both a consequence of what Aquinas thought and a consequence of the church's own philosophical anthropology.
Cool.
So to be clear, at death, the human soul survives and exists uninterrupted throughout the interim state. But I do not. I cease to exist at my death. The human person ceases to exist at his or her death, but comes back into existence at the moment of resurrection, right? So the view is one on which, I have a gap in my existence there. right? It's not saying that the soul doesn't survive. It certainly does. The denial of that would be heretical. And it's not saying that I never exist again, which would also be heretical, because that would amount to a denial of the resurrection. It is just that during that time between death and the resurrection, the human person does not exist. So in support of this, we have Father Peter Coffey in his book Ontology. This is from page 278. He says, quote, "And finally, the subsistence of an individual man is changed or interrupted or ceases by death, which separates his soul, his vital principle, from his body. We say, moreover, that in the latter case, the human person ceases to exist when the identity or permanence of his subsisting substance or nature terminates at death. For personal identity, we hold to be the identity of the complete subsisting substance or nature with itself." So there's a couple technical turns of phrase in there, but for those listeners who aren't familiar with them, right, the important part there is just the human person ceases to exist.
Yeah, he is affirming essentially your position. Yep.
Yeah, and then we have Father Henry Grenier in his Thomistic Philosophy, Volume 1, Logic and Philosophy of Nature, page 524. He's entertaining objections to the survival of the soul here in the passage that I'm about to read, and he's doing it in a very scholastic way. He's going to say, well, this I concede and this I deny. He's making distinctions, right? So he says, the existence of man ceases in such a way that the soul does not retain this existence, I deny. In such a way that the soul retains this existence, I concede. So what he's saying there is the existence of the man, the act of existing, continues in the soul, but not in the man. Right? Because the man ceases to exist. And then we have Father George Clubbertence, the Jesuit, in his The Philosophy of Human Nature, page 313. Nor does the human soul depend on the body for its act of existence. Hence, it cannot be destroyed in the destruction, death of a man. So he's equating death there with destruction of the human person, of the man. Let's see. Here we have Father Robert Edward Brennan, OP, in his Thomistic Psychology, a philosophic analysis of the nature of man, page 251. What precisely is it that survives the cleavage of the body which weds a man's body to his soul in this life? Plato and those who followed in his tradition could say that it is a complete being which endures, a spirit sufficient unto itself, now delivered from its tormentor, matter, a soul leaving behind its corporeal shell to which in life it had merely an accidental affiliation. For Aquinas, on the other hand, only man is a complete being, and man is made up of both body and soul. Accordingly, in the Thomistic Psychology, it is incorrect to speak of the continuance of person beyond the grave. Personal survival, true, but not survival of the person. So what he means there by that last, end quote, what he means there by that last part, personal survival, true, but not survival of the person, is that what survives is a personal entity insofar as it has intellect and will, which the soul does. The soul has intellect and will. It's personal in that sense, but it's not a person.
So I think it's clear. You certainly made a good case that you're not some just obscure, borderline heretic here, right?
And importantly, I could read more. I won't. If your readers want to, if your readers doubt that I could go on, they can email me.
And that'll be a specifically Catholic issue, and this will be viewed by many people. Many people, I'm sure, are not Catholic, but if you are Catholic and you think that this is an issue, pursue this at greater depth. If you're not Catholic, you might be like, well, what does this matter to me? Right.
And what's important, also important, is that these authors that I'm reading from, And these are mostly like new scholastic manuals dating back to the late 19th or early 20th century.
Hmm.
And what's important about that, I guess, is uh, a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them carry the imprimatur of the local bishop and the nihil obstat of the local censor.
Right. So the
Um,
church
uh,
is saying there's nothing wrong with this view,
there's
right?
there's nothing there's no this does not contain any theological errors, and so it's being given the church's approbation, at least at first blush, and it doesn't guarantee that the church, that the Holy See couldn't step in and overturn that, if it thought that this was a issue that where it had to step in. But at least at first blush, somebody who's a well qualified theologian looked at this and talked to the bishop about it, and everybody gave it the A-OK.
Yeah.
And the timing of the books also illustrates, right, that this is happening at a time when uh, the late 19th and early 20th century, when we've had quite a bit of development of the tradition after Aquinas. So it's not as if it's like something like Aquinas denies the Immaculate Conception and the church has made its position really clear since then on this issue, right?
Right.
It's much later than all that. And it's also before the council, before Vatican II. So, it can't be, you can't make the charge that it's somehow a result of bishops going squishy on theology
Right.
or anything. This is solid theological work, and the men, the authors that I'm reading from here are were in their time highly respected Catholic theologians.
Yeah.
So I think there's just no way to get around the fact that it's a view that was defended by respected Catholic theologians, and to which at least prima facie the church has no objection.
Right. Cool. Sorry, it said my internet got a little unstable. Can you still hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Okay. Cool. All right. So yeah, no, continue. Keep going. Yep.
Right. So I just to put I guess a bow on all that. The view is, did you just switch the host there? You all good on your end?
Yeah, sorry, it just cut me
Okay.
out, but put me back in. But I think we're A-okay now. So I heard
Okay.
you say put a bow on it. Let's put that bow on.
So just to put a bow on all that, like you can't get out of the issue by just saying like I'm crazy and out of step with the Catholic tradition. There's just too much evidence to the contrary for that. And at the same time, though, you also can't say that the problem. I don't think it would be fair to say that the problem concerning purgatory and my experience thereof is can just be brushed away.
Right.
I think it is a legitimate issue. And what's interesting is, although I have this, list of modern affirmations of corruptionism by Catholic theologians, some of which I just read, none of them address this difficulty that I just talked about, and more importantly, they don't even seem to see the difficulty.
Yeah,
so, for example,
seem to be aware of it. Yeah.
The Father Crenier quotation that I read, he just says, "Yep, I concede that," and that's the end. He just moves on. I concede that the person does not exist anymore, and he just moves on, almost as if he doesn't realize what he just said or what it would imply for our understanding about purgatory and stuff like that.
And I just want to make it clear, like this is where theology is super cool, right? And it really is a science in itself, where it's like, okay, we have these commitments, right?
Right.
And now, we seem to have attention. So like we need to work this out, right? Like
Right.
reason and logic plays a deep role in good theology. And if we can work it out, we're gonna have a huge issue. So well, maybe we will have to go back and revise, maybe your version or whatever, but it sounds at least plausible to me right now. It sounds like, yeah, this is actually fairly straightforward given the sort of background metaphysical commitments. So let's cut to it, Chris, if you don't mind. Like, what is your solution to this? Do you think that this objection can be overcome?
Well, I don't think it can be overcome if what we mean by overcome is, I can pull some kind of trick out of my philosophical hat by which it turns out that we really do have all those experiences in purgatory. I think the view clearly does entail that I'm not the one who has the relevant experiences. My soul is, and end of story. Now, I do. Let me say.
So just to be clear on my part, your solution is a refinement to the doctrine of purgatory, then.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a refinement of the doctrine, because of course, if you, and this is part of why I'm quite confident that the view is on solid theological ground, is if you go through the church's dogmatic documents on purgatory, you will notice that she never speaks of human persons being in purgatory. She always speaks of the souls in purgatory.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. So let me clarify again. Your solution is a refinement in the common popular view of purgatory.
Yes.
Not the doctrine. Yeah.
Right. And I have a number of things to say about this. Let me just, for the sake of time, narrow it down to two.
Cool.
The first thing to say about this is that Aquinas himself doesn't seem to think that having the experiences in purgatory is really what counts, and that in fact so this is actually from a passage in his commentary on the sentences. The way he thinks that the temporal punishment due to sins works is piecemeal, right? He thinks, well, there's the punishment of the body, and the punishment of the body takes place by way of death. You die, and your body is decomposes, and that's one way in which you're punished for your sins. Mm-hmm. Even if you're saved, right? You die, your body disintegrates, and your body is thereby punished. And your soul gets punished in purgatory, right? And so there's punishment for the body and punishment for the soul. And he thinks that this actually constitutes punishment of the person. And he doesn't think that the person has to have any kind of experiences for this to be punishment of the person.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. So yeah, if you piecemeal it out, then I guess it isn't so much of an issue anymore there.
Now, I think this sounds weird to our contemporary ear, but I think only because we're all under a Cartesian / Lockean spell still.
That's certainly true. Yeah.
A kind of spell where what really matters, like I'm not really there unless, or right, it's not really happening to me unless I'm having the experience of it, or it's not really me unless it's psychologically continuous with me. What I want to suggest is that even a lot of well-meaning Thomists who want to say that, the Cartesian / Lockean picture of personal identity and the human person is to be rejected, are, to the extent that they reject corruptionism, still lingering under this spell to some extent, where they think, well, what really counts is that I'm having the experiences, or what really makes it me is that it's psychologically continuous with me. Aquinas just doesn't think it's necessary. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to, what I'm suggesting is, when you start to think in that way, you slowly become more comfortable with the solution. And that's what I'm offering here, right? I'm offering comfort.
Yes.
And I'm not offering a way out. And here's some more comfort, right?
I love comfort. Yeah, especially when we're talking about purgatory, when all the comfort we can get, right?
Yeah, Christians are already okay with vicarious, kinds of vicarious atonement and vicarious satisfaction, right? The redemption wrought for us by Christ is an instance of just such a thing. And moreover, indulgences, at least for those of us who are Catholic, are an instance of just such a thing. Yes. Nobody who's Catholic has a problem with indulgences.
You shouldn't anyways.
Right. Nor do we have a problem with, the apostolic pardon, which every priest is empowered to grant to people upon the reception of extreme unction, anointing of the sick, which carries the benefits of a plenary indulgence, would deliver that person from purgatory. So if what we're worried about with all this is, well, it seems like I'm getting out of purgatory easy, it's like, well, you could already get out of purgatory easy, right? I mean, it's called indulgences, it's called the apostolic pardon, and so on, right? So if what we're worried about is like, well, I should really have to suffer those punishments, and I'm skating on the punishments. It's like, well, the church has already taught us that you can skate on the punishments, given indulgences. And the church has already taught us that we can skate away from hell, given the redemptive work of Christ and its application to us through baptism and penance. Right. So the idea here is like, look, you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. You're already in for a penny on vicarious atonement and being able to avoid punishments that would otherwise be coming to you in virtue of the redemptive work of Christ, or indulgences and so forth. So why think that there's some kind of deep problem with the idea that I'm not going to end up suffering the punishments?
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that response a lot. First off, in for a penny, in for a pound. You sound like all my Philly cousins. I love it.
Right now, one issue that kind of brings up, though, right, is you start to think, well, okay, well, why should I care about getting this, like obtaining indulgences for myself or for my loved ones if it's not actually going to be me? And there, I think what I want to say is, well, look, there's still something in purgatory. It's the soul of the departed. And you should love that soul. You are bound by Christian charity to love that soul, to love your own soul, certainly, and to love the souls of your family and friends and everybody.
Right. And let me just tie here. Like if it's not about like psychological continuity or memory or things like that, I mean, think of babies, right? Like,
what about babies?
Like I have a baby right now that, arguably is not going to have any memories of the experience she's having. Right. But I'm still very much obligated to care for her.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, so my theory about this got tested last year when my mother passed away. And I, had to actually deal with like, well, how do I feel about like her soul? And I mean, this may just be an effect of me, just having totally bought into my own propaganda at this point. But, I don't feel like I suffered any diminution in my zeal to obtain indulgences for her or to have masses said for her soul and so forth.
Yeah.
I feel like I still very much was moved to do that, and I did it. I think I did it to the same extent that I would have if I had believed that, it was not just my mother's soul, but my mother in purgatory. And the reason why I did that is because I feel like, well, yeah, no, it's not just my mother's not I loved my mother, but I also loved my mother's soul. And I don't want her soul to be suffering any more than I wanted her to be suffering.
We pray for the souls in purgatory. Yeah, this is really fascinating.
And then I think that applies, all the more to our own soul. Like I should not I owe it to myself. I am obliged in charity to love my own soul enough to undergo the requisite penances or obtain the requisite indulgences to make sure that my soul does not end up in purgatory. and of course, what kicks in here is also, what the common Catholic, and I think there's nothing necessarily Catholic, uniquely Catholic about this, Christian advice, right? If you're really going about your spiritual life with the idea that, well, it doesn't matter how long I spend in purgatory, then you're likely not to make it to purgatory.
There's a deeper issue at play here,
right,
my friends.
and as I noted at the beginning, right, if hell is the destination of your soul, then all my view buys you is a short respite, a negligible respite, given the fact that the destiny in question is eternal.
Yeah.
So right, I mean, what good is a couple millennia off of your sentence of eternal damnation if it's truly eternal damnation? It shouldn't. Right, it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
Right. So now the other thing I say about purgatory is that is the following: that insofar as we're worried about it really being me in purgatory, part of that is also coming from the idea that what's happening in purgatory is I'm growing in virtue or something like that. That look, you might think, okay, well, look, your soul can undergo these temporal punishments on account of sin on your behalf, but your soul can't be sanctified on your behalf. And part of what we think is going on in purgatory is the sanctification of your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think, is an accretion that has crept. This is an addition that has crept into our doctrine of purgatory to kind of mollify Protestants about
the sanctification versus satisfaction.
Yeah, that's right.
Ideas of the purgatory.
Obviously, for reasons that go back to the Reformation, Protestants are not real happy with satisfaction models of what's going on in purgatory. So I think what has actually happened is this idea of this sanctification model of purgatory has become popular in Catholic circles because it makes purgatory, in part because it makes purgatory more palatable to Protestants. And while it's a laudable goal to try to convince Protestants that purgatory is consistent with the rest of their Christian beliefs, I think the sanctification model is inconsistent with Catholic dogma. And the reason it's inconsistent, well, not dogma, but doctrine. The reason it's inconsistent with Catholic doctrine is because if what you really thought was happening in purgatory was the sanctification of the soul, then you would ordinarily be committed to the idea that what's going on in purgatory, like that the soul is not just growing in sanctity, but also in merit. Because every growth in sanctity on the part of someone who's in sanctifying grace and justice before God merits a reward from God in heavenly glory, right? So it would result in this soul would have additional merit and therefore a higher place in heaven once it made it to heaven.
Yes.
But that's actually inconsistent with what the church tells us about death, which is that the possibility of merit and demerit ends at death.
Yes.
Right. So the possibility of merit and demerit ends at death. Therefore, the possibility of sanctification ends at death. And therefore, whatever's happening in purgatory can't be sanctification.
So you don't think the sanctification model is not just incomplete. You just think it's inconsistent.
I don't think it's consistent with what's actually with Catholic doctrine about the end of probation, with the end of the possibility of merit. Right, like the level of merit that you're going to have for the rest of eternity, or demerit, as the case may be, and the corresponding level of glory that you will enjoy in heaven, or level of punishment that you will suffer in hell, is completely fixed.
Right. Yeah, so that's interesting because I've heard a number of Catholics recently. I won't mention their names because they're not here to defend themselves, but say uh, agree that there's something missing if you leave out the satisfaction model, but I think they would only say there's something missing. And you're saying, and I think what you're saying is that no, the satisfaction model is that's just it, right?
That's just it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one way to one way of making a retort to this is to say, well, growth in sanctity doesn't require a growth in merit. That's the link that I'm making, and that link could be denied. But then that just sets up a problem for the advocate of the sanctification model, because then I can just come back and be like, well, why do I care about sanctity if it doesn't actually get me anything better in heaven, right? Like if it doesn't increase my merit, and the glory of the place that I'll enjoy in heaven, then it's not clear why I should care about sanctification, right?
Yeah.
Now you could say, well, you should care about sanctification for its own sake, but it's clearly an integral part of the Christian and especially the Catholic tradition that everything we do to advance in sanctity has a corresponding reward from God, right? There's no growth in sanctity without a reward from God, in the form of glory in heaven, right? The merit and glory in heaven is exactly proportioned to the level to our sanctity on earth.
Got it. So just to kind of back up again and just kind of summarize, I think my understanding of your view anyways is that that the tension is superficial, you would argue, but it probably requires a refinement of most people's common understanding of purgatory, but not of the doctrine, not as the church has formally taught it, just as a common understanding of people in the pews. Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment?
That's right. I think what I'm suggesting is a return to the actual Catholic doctrine of purgatory.
So I'm trying to find this squishy, like C.S. Lewis middle ground on it, right?
In its pure form, in its pure form, and in a way that's consistent with what the church wants to say about sanctification and merit and glory in heaven. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. No, that's super. That gives me a lot to think about. That's really interesting, and I like a lot of what I hear. My goodness, we've been going on, and we still wanted to cover divine simplicity. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling fine.
You sure? Because we could break this up. It's totally up to you.
Well, you know what? I guess I am thinking. If, for the sake of your listeners, perhaps we should break it up.
If it's cool with you to come back on whenever it's convenient, we could just make this.
I'd be happy to do that because honestly, like, yeah, I mean, I could go on for, given what you've given me here on divine simplicity, we could be here for an inordinate amount of
all right, we're gonna make that a separate episode then. That just
I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm also happy that it'll be good because this way we've actually been able to give I guess a nice full in-depth treatment of the soul and the interim state stuff, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad we took our time because this has been a really fascinating conversation, especially for me. I'll be very curious to hear everybody's response because there's going to be, I think one of the benefits of my podcast, I have people coming in from all different angles. So there'll be Catholics listening to this, there'll be Protestants, there'll be I'm sure some materialists. So don't worry, Chris, you're gonna cause disagreement with with people along all different avenues here, which is cool. That's what we're after. We're after good arguments and trying to follow, we're just trying to get things right philosophically and theologically. I also appreciate the span of this conversation. I like that we did start from the armchair, but then we're working through the sort of implications of revelation as well. So
yeah, I think that's philosophy at its best as the handmaiden of theology.
Yeah. So before we say goodbye, then, would you mind just giving everybody just a quick rundown of anywhere that they can keep up with your work? I know you blog.
Sure.
Yeah. So everything that you want people to know about what you do, your work, and how to keep up with it.
Sure. Yeah. So I have a very incipient blog. I make no promises about. It's really just like a place for me to jot down arguments that I might be interested in developing further for publication at some point, and as a way of kind of like being noting, putting a date on it, and noting that I had this idea at a certain time.
Yep. Love it.
So I make no promises about the content on the blog, but insofar as anybody would be interested in keeping up with that, it's matterofargument.blogspot.com. Most of what I have on there so far is just stuff about divine simplicity, because I've been thinking quite a bit about.
I liked your short one about the communicable and incommunicable attributes of God. We'll touch on that on our next conversation. That'll be a good one.
Sure. And then for your readers who are interested in my published work, the easiest way to find that would probably just be to go to my academic website, which if you just Google my name, it'll come right up. But it's at firstphilosophy.net.
Very cool. I'll link both of those in the show notes. Chris, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me on.